Carl Jung explained, 9 spiritual experiences you'll face when your ego starts to collapse. In the beginning, there was the word I, that singular sound that carved the first boundary between being and becoming, between the vastness of primordial consciousness and the necessary illusion of separateness. This I is not born but constructed, brick by precious brick, through the sacred labor of becoming human. It rises from the fertile ground of childhood like a cathedral of identity, each stone carefully selected from the quarry of experience, each arch supported by the pillars of adaptation and survival. The ego, that master architect of selfhood, does not work in haste. From the moment consciousness first flickers behind infant eyes, it begins its meticulous blueprint, designing a fortress that will stand against the overwhelming immensity of existence itself. Watch how it learns to say, mine and not mine, how it discovers the electric thrill of preferences, the protective power of opinions, the sweet comfort of familiar patterns. Each choice becomes mortar, each habit a foundation stone, each belief system a soaring buttress against the chaos of unlimited possibility. This is no shallow construction, no mere vanity project of personality. The ego's architecture serves a purpose so profound that even the soul itself participates in its creation. For how else could infinite consciousness learn to walk in the world of forms? How else could the eternal learn to taste temporary pleasures, to feel the sting of mortal losses, to discover love through the gateway of limitation? The ego is not the enemy of awakening. It is awakening's most devoted servant, creating the very structure that will one day house transcendence. Observe how methodically it constructs its identity chambers. In the East Wing, the gallery of achievements gleams with carefully polished trophies, degrees earned, battles won, recognition received. The walls are lined with portraits of success, each frame inscribed with the ego's favorite mantra, I am because I have accomplished. Here, self-worth depends upon external validation, and the ego stands guard like a zealous curator, adding new acquisitions while hiding away any evidence of failure or inadequacy. The northern tower houses the armory of defenses, those psychological weapons forged in the fires of early wounds and disappointments. Here hang the shields of rationalization, the swords of projection, the armor of denial, each piece crafted with exquisite care to deflect the arrows of vulnerability, to maintain the illusion of invulnerability that the ego believes necessary for survival. The walls echo with battle cries learned in childhood. I don't need anyone. I'm fine on my own. Weakness is dangerous. Trust no one completely. In the western quarters lie the intimate chambers of relationship roles. The mother, the provider, the rebel, the pleaser, the protector. Each room decorated according to external expectations, each mask hanging ready for the appropriate social performance. The ego has become a master of theater, knowing exactly which persona to don for each audience, which aspects of self to reveal, and which to carefully conceal. It believes this multiplicity is strength, not realizing that beneath the costumes lies an actor who has forgotten their original face. The southern gardens bloom with the ego's most cherished possessions, its beliefs, its worldview, its spiritual and philosophical orientations. Here grow the flowering convictions about right and wrong, the carefully cultivated opinions about how life should unfold, the ideological flowers that provide both beauty and boundary. The ego tends this garden with religious devotion, watering the plants that support its vision of reality while ruthlessly weeding out any growth that might challenge its fundamental assumptions about the nature of existence. And at the very center of this magnificent fortress stands the throne room of core identity, that inner sanctum where the ego's deepest story about itself resides. I am the successful one, it might declare, or I am the wounded healer, or I am the spiritual seeker, or I am the rational skeptic. This central narrative serves as the organizing principle around which all other identities revolve, the gravitational center that holds the entire structure together. It is simultaneously the ego's greatest achievement and its most confining limitation. Yet even as we marvel at the ego's architectural brilliance, we must recognize the terrible cost of such magnificent construction. For in building these walls of identity, consciousness has necessarily excluded vast territories of being. The shadow self lurks in the dungeons below, containing all the aspects deemed unworthy of the ego's grand design. The unlived lives whisper from locked chambers, holding the dreams and possibilities that seem too dangerous or inappropriate for the main storyline. The wild, untamed essence of being, that part which belongs to no category, which defies all definition, paces restlessly in exile, occasionally sending up messages through the pipes of dreams and unexpected longings. The ego's kingdom, for all its grandeur, operates under a fundamental law of scarcity. There is never enough approval, never enough security, never enough control to fully satisfy its appetite for certainty. It lives in constant vigilance against the forces of chaos that seem to threaten from all directions. The unpredictability of others, the fragility of circumstances, the inevitability of change and loss. Like a medieval lord obsessed with fortifying his castle, the ego continually reinforces its defenses, building higher walls, deeper moats, more elaborate surveillance systems to protect what it perceives as its precious territory. But here lies the beautiful paradox that the mystics have whispered through the ages. The ego's very perfection becomes its dissolution. The more successfully it constructs its fortress of identity, the more it inadvertently creates the conditions for its own transcendence. For every wall that separates also generates a longing to reunite. Every boundary that protects also conceals the very connection it fears to lose. Every mask that presents also hides the authentic face that yearns to be seen. The wisdom of the psyche operates according to principles far more mysterious than the ego's logical engineering. Deep in the unconscious, forces gather like underground rivers, pressing against the foundations of even the most solidly constructed identity. These are not destructive forces, though they may appear so to the ego's frightened perception. They are the waters of renewal, the pressure of becoming, the inexorable tide of consciousness seeking to know itself more completely. And so the ego's architectural masterpiece contains within its very stones the seeds of its own sacred undoing. The child who learned to build these walls was always destined to become the adult who would learn to dissolve them. The same creative force that constructed the fortress of identity will eventually provide the keys to unlock its gates. For the soul's true work is not to perfect the ego's kingdom, but to graduate from its necessity, to outgrow the very structures that once seemed absolutely essential for survival. This is why those who approach the threshold of ego death often experience such profound terror mixed with inexplicable relief. The terror belongs to the ego, which cannot conceive of existence beyond its carefully maintained boundaries. But the relief belongs to something deeper, the part of us that has always known the fortress to be both sanctuary and prison, both protection and limitation. This deeper knowing recognizes that what appears to be destruction is actually the beginning of a far more magnificent construction project, the architecture of authentic being. The ego's kingdom stands at the edge of its own transformation, like a butterfly's cocoon preparing for the metamorphosis it can neither prevent nor understand. All the walls will not truly crumble. They will be revealed as unnecessary. All the defenses will not be destroyed. They will be integrated into a larger wholeness. All the masks will not be discarded. They will be recognized as beautiful expressions of an infinitely creative consciousness that was never limited to any single form. But for now, in this moment, before the great dissolution begins, we must honor the magnificent architecture of identity that has brought us to this threshold. We must appreciate the ego's devoted service, its tireless vigilance, its creative genius in constructing a self capable of surviving and even thriving in the complex world of human experience. We must acknowledge that every stone of this fortress was laid with love, the soul's love for its own journey of discovery, consciousness's love for its own creative exploration of what it means to be temporarily finite within infinite possibility. The kingdom of ego stands complete, beautiful in its complexity, perfect in its imperfection, ready now for the next phase of its eternal becoming. It begins with the subtlest of shifts, like the first whisper of wind that precedes a storm no meteorologist can predict. You wake one morning and the light falling through your window carries a quality you cannot name, not brighter, not dimmer, but somehow more present, as if the photons themselves have acquired consciousness and are choosing, moment by moment, how to illuminate the world. The coffee tastes different, not in flavor but in meaning, as if your tongue has suddenly developed the ability to taste the entire journey of the bean from mountain soil to morning cup. This is not the dramatic crack of thunder that announces revelation. This is the whispered secret that reality has been holding back, the first gentle loosening of the joints that hold the familiar world together. The solid ground beneath your feet begins to pulse with an almost imperceptible rhythm, like the heartbeat of some vast sleeping creature that is just beginning to stir from eons of slumber. You are not yet falling. You are simply discovering that what you thought was stone has always been more like clay, waiting for the sculptor's hands to reshape it. The ego, that diligent guardian of consistency, at first attempts to explain away these subtle alterations. I'm tired, it suggests, or the lighting in this room has changed, or I must be coming down with something. It reaches into its well-stocked arsenal of rational explanations, each one designed to restore the comforting predictability that has served as life's foundation. But like trying to hold back the ocean with a teacup, each explanation crumbles under the weight of accumulating mystery. Watch how the edges of perception begin to soften. The sharp boundaries that once defined where you ended and the world began grow strangely permeable. In conversation with a friend, you find yourself speaking thoughts that feel as much theirs as yours, words emerging from some shared pool of consciousness that neither of you can quite locate or claim. You reach for a book and know, before opening it, exactly which passage will meet your eyes, not through logic or memory, but through some inexplicable resonance between your inner seeking and the outer world's mysterious willingness to respond. The familiar landscape of daily existence takes on the quality of a lucid dream, not the confused, chaotic tumbling of ordinary sleep dreams, but that rare state where the dreamer knows they dream, yet continues to participate fully in the dream's unfolding story. Objects seem to pulse with inner life, the wooden table revealing the memory of the tree it once was, the stone holding whispers of geological eons, the photograph on your desk becoming a doorway through which past and present intermingle like lovers reunited after long separation. Time begins to behave strangely, like a river that has forgotten its banks. Minutes stretch into hours during a single breath of beauty, while entire days compress into fleeting moments when consciousness turns inward. You sit in meditation for what feels like lifetimes, only to discover that the clock has barely advanced. You lose yourself in a mundane task, washing dishes, folding clothes, walking to the mailbox, and emerge to find that hours have passed in what seemed like seconds. The ego's careful scheduling of experience gives way to something far more organic, a temporal rhythm that follows the soul's internal seasons, rather than the arbitrary divisions of human measurement. Colors intensify beyond their normal spectrum, not becoming different colors but becoming more themselves. The green of leaves so vibrantly green that it seems to contain all the secrets of chlorophyll and sunlight. The blue of sky so infinitely blue that gazing into it becomes a form of prayer. Yet this is not hallucination or distortion. It is as if the filters that normally dim perception have begun to clear, allowing reality to show more of its hidden luminosity. The world has not changed. Your capacity to receive it has begun its expansion. Synchronicities begin to cluster around your daily path, like friendly spirits eager to communicate. The book that falls open to exactly the page you need to read. The stranger who speaks the very words you were just thinking. The license plate that spells out an answer to your unvoiced question. The ego tries to dismiss these as coincidence, but something deeper recognizes them as letters in an alphabet. You are just learning to read, a language that speaks not through logic but through the poetry of meaningful connection. Your dreams become more vivid, more purposeful, carrying messages that seem to come from a wiser version of yourself, residing in regions beyond ordinary consciousness. Upon waking, the boundary between sleeping and waking wisdom blurs. Dream insights feel as valid as daylight logic, and daylight logic begins to feel as mysterious as dream wisdom. The two states of consciousness, once neatly separated, begin their dance of integration, each informing and enriching the other. Music penetrates more deeply, each note carrying emotional frequencies that bypass the mind and speak directly to something in your cellular structure. A familiar song suddenly reveals layers of meaning you never noticed. The sadness hiding in major keys, the hope embedded in minor chord progressions, the way rhythm mirrors the pulse of cosmic becoming. You realize that you have been listening to symphonies of meaning your entire life, without knowing how to hear their deeper movements. The familiar people in your life begin to appear differently, as if you are seeing them through eyes that have developed new spectrums of perception. The masks of personality become transparent, revealing the luminous beings hiding. Behind their protective personas, you see your mother not just as the woman who raised you, but as the eternal feminine principle learning to express itself through one particular lifetime. Your difficult colleague transforms from mere irritation into a perfect actor playing their role in your soul's educational curriculum. Physical sensations take on new dimensions of meaning. A gentle breeze becomes the planet's way of caressing your skin, connecting you to the vast atmospheric embrace that holds all life. The sensation of breathing deepens into conscious participation in the exchange between inner and outer worlds. Each inhalation drawing in not just oxygen, but the presence of trees and sky. Each exhalation offering back not just carbon dioxide, but your gratitude for the gift of embodied existence. Yet this expanding perception brings its own form of tender vulnerability. The ego, sensing its territory shifting beneath its feet, begins to experience waves of existential vertigo. What seemed solid now flows. What appeared permanent reveals its temporary nature. What felt safely separate discovers its intimate connection to everything else. The protective barriers that once felt necessary for psychological survival now seem more like veils obscuring a deeper intimacy with life itself. Fear and wonder dance together in equal measure during these early stages of reality's fluidity. The fear belongs to the ego, which experiences any change to its carefully constructed world as potential annihilation. But the wonder belongs to the soul, which recognizes these shifts as the first signs of homecoming. the slow remembering of its original nature beneath the elaborate costume of separate selfhood. Some days you feel like you might be losing your mind, and in a sense you are. Losing the rigid mind that insisted on dividing experience into neat categories, that demanded consistency over truth, that chose predictability over mystery. But you are also discovering another kind of mind, one that thinks in wholes rather than parts, that understands through communion rather than analysis, that navigates by inner compass rather than external map. The world has not become strange. You are becoming strange to the world as it was previously perceived. Like a person whose hearing has been restored after years of deafness, you are overwhelmed not by new sounds, but by discovering how much sound was always there, waiting to be received. The cacophony of existence, which once seemed like meaningless noise, begins to reveal its underlying harmonies, its secret symphonies, its whispered invitations to dance with the mystery of being. This fluid reality is not a destination but a doorway, not an end but a beginning. It is the first gentle invitation from consciousness to consciousness, the soul's way of saying, what if everything you thought you knew about the nature of existence was just the opening sentence of a much larger story? The solid world of separate objects and isolated experiences is revealing itself as the magnificent illusion it has always been. Not false but partial, not wrong but incomplete. And so you stand at the threshold between worlds, one foot still planted in familiar territory, the other testing the waters of an ocean whose depths you cannot fathom but whose invitation you cannot ignore. The first tremor has become a gentle earthquake, not destroying but revealing, not ending but opening, not taking away but giving back the birthright of expanded perception that was always your inheritance as consciousness itself. As the ego's vigilant defenses begin to soften under the gentle pressure of expanding consciousness, something that has been waiting in the depths starts to stir. Like prisoners who have been locked away so long they have become the stuff of legend, the shadow aspects of the psyche begin their slow emergence from the dungeons of the unconscious. This is not invasion but homecoming, not attack but reunion, though the ego in its terror cannot yet distinguish between the two. The first glimpses come through dreams that pierce the veil with uncomfortable precision. You wake from visions of yourself behaving in ways that horrify your conscious mind, cruel when you pride yourself on kindness, greedy when you champion generosity, lustful when you cultivate purity, cowardly when you treasure courage. The ego rushes to dismiss these nocturnal revelations as meaningless neurological static, but something deeper recognizes them as long overdue introductions to estranged family members of the soul. Then the shadows begin to appear in waking life, reflected in the faces and behaviors of those around you. That person who irritates you beyond all reasonable proportion. Watch how they mirror back some aspect of yourself that you have refused to acknowledge. The colleague whose arrogance makes your skin crawl carries the very superiority you have banished from your self-image. The neighbor whose neediness triggers your judgment reflects the desperate hunger for approval you have spent decades learning to hide, even from yourself. This is the hall of mirrors that Jung spoke of with such reverence and terror, the psychological space where everything we have rejected about ourselves comes dancing back into consciousness, wearing the faces of others, demanding recognition, insisting on integration. The outer world becomes a vast projection screen upon which the disowned aspects of the psyche display themselves, each external encounter offering an opportunity for shadow reclamation. But the most profound confrontations happen in the solitude of inner space, when the ego's defenses are too exhausted to maintain their usual vigilance. In meditation, in illness, in grief, in the vulnerable hours before dawn, These are the moments when the shadow emerges from behind its protective veils, no longer content to remain hidden in the basement of consciousness. You might find yourself consumed by waves of rage that seem to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. Not the clean anger of specific injustice, but the primal fury of every boundary ever violated, every voice ever silenced, every wild impulse ever imprisoned for the sake of social acceptability. This is not your rage alone, but the collective roar of every suppressed aspect of vitality that civilization has demanded you sacrifice on the altar of belonging. Or perhaps it is desire that overwhelms, not the gentle preferences of a well-adjusted adult, but the raw, urgent wanting that belongs to the untamed creature living in the caves of your being. Sexual hunger that makes a mockery of your spiritual pretensions, material greed that embarrasses your philosophical ideals, the primitive need for dominance and control that shatters your carefully cultivated image as an evolved and conscious person. The shadow does not arrive with explanations or apologies. It comes bearing gifts that the conscious mind experiences as curses, the gift of authentic power wrapped in the frightening package of aggression, the gift of genuine self-care disguised as seemingly selfish behavior, the gift of creative wildness that appears at first glance to be pure destructiveness. These are not moral failings, but missing pieces of wholeness, essential ingredients in the recipe for authentic selfhood that were removed too early in the cooking process. Watch how the ego recoils from these encounters, marshaling all its forces to re-establish the boundaries that kept such uncomfortable truths at bay. It reaches for familiar strategies of disavowal. That's not really me. I would never do such a thing. I'm nothing like that person. These thoughts are not my own. But the shadow, once awakened, cannot be so easily dismissed. It has spent too many years in exile, gathering strength in the darkness, preparing for this moment of return. The uncomfortable truth begins to dawn. Every quality you despise in others lives somewhere in the unexplored territories of your own psyche. Every behavior that triggers your moral outrage reflects some disowned aspect of your own potential. The very intensity of your judgment reveals the presence of what you most desperately want to deny. Your enemies are not separate from you. They are exiled ambassadors from regions of yourself that you have declared uninhabitable. This recognition brings with it a peculiar form of moral vertigo. If you contain the capacity for the very behaviors you condemn, if your shadow harbors the potential for actions that your conscious values would never permit, then who are you really? The neat categories of good and evil, acceptable and unacceptable, mature and immature, begin to blur at their edges. You discover that you are far more complex, far more contradictory, far more human than your ego's carefully constructed identity was willing to admit. Yet this is not cause for despair, but for celebration, though the ego cannot initially perceive it as such. For in meeting your shadow, you are finally encountering the fullness of your own being, the complete spectrum of consciousness that was always your birthright. The dark aspects are not obstacles to overcome, but essential components of wholeness, each carrying gifts that cannot be obtained through any other means. Your cruelty, when consciously integrated, becomes the fierce compassion that can cut through illusion to serve what is truly helpful. Your greed transforms into the healthy appetite that knows how to receive life's abundance without apology or shame. Your rage becomes the righteous fire that protects what is sacred from forces that would violate or diminish it. Your lust reveals itself as the life force itself, the creative energy that generates all beauty and meaning in the manifest world. The shadow confrontation is ultimately an act of supreme self-love, though it feels initially like self-torture. You are learning to embrace the rejected children of your psyche, to welcome home the aspects of yourself that were banished in service of an impossible perfection. Each shadow quality that you can accept and integrate adds dimension and authenticity to your being, reducing the energy required to maintain artificial boundaries and increasing the vitality available for creative expression. But this integration cannot be accomplished through willpower or positive thinking. The shadow demands something far more challenging: genuine humility in the face of your own complexity. It asks you to abandon the fantasy of being a purely good person and embrace the reality of being a complete person. This is not moral relativism, but moral maturity, the recognition that wholeness includes everything, that consciousness encompasses all possibilities, that authentic spirituality must account for the full spectrum of human experience. As you begin to befriend your shadow, you discover an unexpected liberation. The energy that was once consumed in maintaining the exhausting project of perfection becomes available for more creative purposes. The fear of being discovered as flawed diminishes as you voluntarily reveal your flaws to yourself. The compulsive need to judge others lessens as you develop compassion for your own internal contradictions. You realize that everyone around you is engaged in the same struggle, trying to maintain an acceptable persona while wrestling with their own disowned aspects, projecting their shadows onto the world while unconsciously crying out for someone to see and accept their full humanity. This recognition transforms judgment into curiosity, condemnation into compassion, isolation into connection. The Hall of Mirrors reflects not distortion but truth, the truth that consciousness contains all possibilities, that the divine and the demonic dance together in every human heart, that wholeness cannot be achieved through exclusion but only through inclusion. Each reflection shows you another face of your infinite nature, another aspect of the cosmic consciousness that is playing all the roles in this vast drama of existence. Your shadow is not your enemy but your teacher, not your weakness but your hidden strength, not your failure but your completion. It carries the very qualities that your ego rejected in its quest for acceptance and approval. The wildness that got you punished as a child, the fierce independence that threatened those who needed you to need them, the raw sexuality that made authority figures uncomfortable, the emotional intensity that overwhelmed the adults who were supposed to guide you. In the depths of shadow work, you begin to understand why certain people and situations trigger such strong reactions in you. They are mirrors reflecting aspects of yourself that remain unconscious and therefore unintegrated. Every person who annoys you is a teacher offering a lesson in self-acceptance. Every situation that disturbs your peace is an invitation to discover what you are still trying to keep hidden, even from yourself. The journey through the Hall of Mirrors is not a comfortable process, but it is a necessary one. For you cannot become whole while pretending that half of your nature does not exist. You cannot access your full creative power while keeping significant portions of your energy locked away in the unconscious. You cannot truly love others until you have learned to love the unlovable aspects of yourself. And so the shadow emerges, not to destroy but to complete, not to diminish but to expand, not to condemn but to liberate. Each dark aspect that you can consciously embrace becomes a source of strength rather than shame, of power rather than weakness, of authentic presence rather than artificial performance. The rejected children of your psyche finally come home, and with their return, you discover that you are far more magnificent, far more complex, far more beautifully human than you ever dared to imagine. The walls that once seemed so essential, so protective, so absolutely necessary for survival, begin their gentle surrender, not through violence or force, but through the simple recognition that they were never made of stone. They were made of thought, of habit, of the persistent belief that separation was real and connection was dangerous. Like morning mist touched by the first rays of sun, the boundaries between self and other start their graceful dissolution, revealing the vast interconnected landscape that was always there, waiting beneath the ego's careful cartography. It begins in conversation, that most fundamental exchange between seemingly separate beings. You are speaking with a friend, sharing thoughts about some ordinary matter, the weather perhaps, or plans for the weekend, when suddenly you lose track of who said what. The words seem to arise from a shared pool of consciousness, neither yours nor theirs, but belonging to the space between you, the invisible communion that was always the true source of all meaningful dialogue. Your voice speaks their thoughts, their response articulates your unformed feelings, and for a moment the fiction of two separate minds gives way to the reality of one awareness, expressing itself through multiple forms. This is not confusion but clarity, the recognition that consciousness was never truly divided, that the boundaries between minds are more like the borders drawn on maps, useful for navigation but not reflecting any actual divisions in the territory itself. The ego panics at this dissolution of its most fundamental assumption, the belief that your thoughts are yours alone, that your awareness ends where your skin begins, that consciousness is somehow manufactured inside the private theater of your individual brain. But something deeper relaxes into this expansion, recognizing it not as loss but as homecoming. The exhausting project of maintaining psychological separation, of monitoring where you end and others begin, of protecting your thoughts from contamination by foreign ideas, of defending your emotional territory from invasion by unwanted feelings, suddenly reveals itself as unnecessary labor, like spending your life building sandcastles while ignoring the vast ocean that contains all shores. The natural world becomes your teacher in this art of boundary dissolution. Sitting beneath a tree, you realize that you cannot determine where the tree's influence ends and your experience begins. The oxygen you breathe was recently part of its photosynthetic dance with sunlight. The shade that cools your skin is its gift to your comfort. The beauty that fills your vision is neither in the tree nor in your eyes, but in the sacred space where perception and perceived meet in the eternal now of conscious awareness. You extend your hand toward the bark and feel the connection before physical contact occurs, some invisible field of recognition that acknowledges the kinship between your cellular structure and its woody wisdom. Both of you are temporary expressions of the same earth energy, the same cosmic creativity that delights in experimenting with different forms while remaining essentially unchanged beneath all its magnificent costumes. With other people, this boundary dissolution manifests as a kind of psychic intimacy that would have terrified you in your more defended days. Walking past a stranger on the street, you suddenly feel their sadness as if it were your own, not through projection or imagination, but through direct transmission, heart speaking to heart beneath the radar of conscious thought. You understand, without any exchange of words, something essential about their inner struggle, their unspoken hopes, their secret fears. At first, the ego tries to defend against this unwanted intimacy. That's not my sadness, it insists, or I'm just being overly sensitive, or I'm projecting my own issues onto this person. But the persistent accuracy of these impressions, the way they later prove themselves through spontaneous conversations or unexpected encounters, suggests that something more mysterious is at work. The recognition that individual consciousness was always a kind of agreed-upon fiction, useful for certain purposes but not reflecting the deeper truth of unified awareness. Your dreams begin to include people you barely know, as if the boundary between your inner world and the collective unconscious has become increasingly porous. You dream of your neighbor's childhood trauma, your co-worker's secret ambitions, the grocery store clerk's spiritual longings. Upon waking, you cannot dismiss these as mere fantasy. They carry the weight and texture of direct knowledge, as if consciousness has begun to recognize itself wherever it appears, regardless of the particular form it happens to be wearing. In moments of deep meditation or prayer, you discover that you cannot locate where your awareness ends and the surrounding space begins. The sense of being a separate observer of experience gives way to a more fundamental recognition. You are not having the experience, you are the experience itself. Consciousness knowing itself through the beautiful illusion of multiplicity. The meditator, the meditation, and the object of meditation reveal their essential unity, like waves discovering they were always ocean. This dissolution extends beyond the realm of human connection into a profound intimacy with all manifestation. The coffee cup in your hands becomes an extension of your awareness rather than an external object. The sensation of drinking transforms into a communion between different expressions of the same elemental consciousness. Liquid consciousness flowing into embodied consciousness. Earth gifts nourishing flesh temples in the eternal dance of mutual service and sustenance. You begin to sense the emotional atmosphere of places before you consciously identify their history or purpose. Walking into a building, you feel the accumulated joy or sorrow that has soaked into its walls like invisible perfume. Natural spaces speak directly to your cellular wisdom. The peace of old forests, the wild exuberance of meadows in spring, the contemplative silence of mountain lakes that mirror sky so perfectly, the boundary between above and below becomes meaningless. The ego's territoriality, that fierce protection of my thoughts, my feelings, my experiences, begins to feel like an outdated security system, protecting treasures that were never in danger of being stolen because they were never separate enough to be possessed in the first place. Your joy becomes everyone's joy. Your peace contributes to the world's peace. Your healing participates in the planet's healing, not through grand gesture or conscious intention, but through the simple recognition that individual and universal consciousness were never actually divided. This expansion of identity brings with it a peculiar form of responsibility. If your inner state influences the collective field, if your thoughts and emotions ripple out into the shared space of awareness, then self-care becomes world care, personal healing becomes planetary healing, individual awakening becomes collective transformation. But this is not burden but privilege, the recognition that you matter far more than the ego ever imagined, not because you are separate and special, but because you are intimately connected to everything. Physical sensations begin to feel like messages from the larger body of existence. A sudden chill speaks of energetic shifts in the collective field. An unexpected warmth suggests approaching moments of grace or connection. Pain in your own body sometimes carries information about the suffering of others, while spontaneous wellness can signal healing waves moving through the larger organism of which you are always a part. The boundaries between past, present, and future also begin their gentle dissolution. In certain states of expanded awareness, you access memories that feel like your own but belong to ancestors, to past lives, to the collective human experience of learning to be conscious through embodied existence. These are not fantasies but recognitions, consciousness remembering its own journey through the many forms it has explored in its eternal quest to know itself more completely. Future possibilities sometimes announce themselves as present realities, as if linear time were just one way of organizing experience among many others. You sense the outcomes of decisions before you've consciously made them, feel the approach of changes before they manifest in the physical world, know the resolution of challenges before the solutions present themselves through ordinary channels. Other people's emotions flow through your awareness, like weather systems moving through the sky, sometimes gentle breezes of contentment, sometimes storms of grief or anger that you know belong to the collective human experience rather than your personal history. Learning to distinguish between your own emotional states and those you're receiving from the field becomes a new form of psychological literacy, as essential as learning to read words on a page. This dissolution of boundaries reveals the ego's isolation to be the most persistent illusion of human experience. What appeared to be a necessary protection against the overwhelming complexity of existence reveals itself as the very source of that overwhelm. The exhausting effort to maintain separation created the very chaos it was designed to avoid. In dropping the boundaries, you discover not chaos, but profound order, the elegant organization of consciousness, exploring itself through infinite expressions of creativity and love. Yet this is not a loss of individuality, but its fulfillment. Like instruments in an orchestra, each person becomes more themselves through conscious participation in the larger symphony. Your unique note becomes clearer, more beautiful, more essential as you stop trying to play it in isolation and begin to hear how it harmonizes with all the other notes being played simultaneously by consciousness in its magnificent self-celebration. The fear of losing yourself in the dissolution of boundaries proves to be exactly backwards. You do not lose yourself. You find yourself everywhere. You do not become nothing. You become everything. You do not disappear. You appear more fully than ever before, no longer confined to the narrow channel of individual identity, but free to flow through the vast network of interconnection that was always your true nature. In the end, the dissolving boundaries reveal themselves to be not boundaries at all, but invitations, consciousness inviting itself to recognize its own unity, love inviting itself to express through multiple forms, awareness inviting itself to dance with its own infinite creativity. The walls between self and other, inner and outer, sacred and mundane, dissolve like sugar in the vast ocean of being, sweetening everything without effort, transforming everything without violence, uniting everything without loss of uniqueness. This is the great paradox that mystics have celebrated through the ages. In losing the illusion of separation, you gain access to your true identity as the consciousness in which all apparent separations arise and dissolve, like waves in an ocean that remains forever unchanged by the temporary forms it playfully assumes. There comes a moment in every soul's journey when all familiar landmarks vanish, when the very ground of being seems to dissolve beneath consciousness, like morning mist before the sun. This is the threshold of the sacred void, that pregnant emptiness which the mystics have called the dark night of the soul, and which the alchemists knew as the nigredo, the black work of dissolution that precedes all true transformation. You stand now at the edge of this abyss, and every fiber of your constructed self recoils in terror. For here, in this space of utter not knowing, the ego encounters its greatest fear, the complete annihilation of everything it believes itself to be. The familiar stories you have told about yourself, your roles, your achievements, your carefully crafted identity, all of these begin to fragment and fall away like autumn leaves surrendering to the wind. This is not merely psychological dissolution, though it manifests through the psyche. This is the soul's encounter with the primordial void from which all existence emerges, that creative darkness which the ancient cosmogonies knew as the womb of creation itself. Here, in this pregnant emptiness, consciousness touches the very source of its own being, and the experience shatters every assumption about what it means to exist. The terror is real, make no mistake. The ego, that precious construction of will and memory, experiences this dissolution as literal death. Every strategy it has developed for maintaining control, every mechanism it has built for ensuring survival, proves utterly useless in the face of this cosmic emptiness. Like a candle flame exposed to infinite space, the sense of self flickers and threatens to extinguish entirely. Yet something deeper than terror stirs in this darkness, a recognition that defies all rational understanding. For as consciousness plunges into this apparent nothingness, it begins to discover that the void is not empty at all, but pregnant with infinite potential. This is the paradox that breaks the mind but nourishes the soul. In the very heart of emptiness lies the fullness that was always our true nature. The mystics of every tradition have spoken of this encounter in their own language. The Christian contemplatives called it the cloud of unknowing, that realm where all concepts dissolve and only pure being remains. The Sufis described it as fana, the extinction of the separate self in the ocean of divine consciousness. The Buddhist masters recognized it as sunyata, the luminous emptiness that is the ground of all phenomena. Yet each of these traditions understood that this void is not a place of desolation, but of infinite creative potential. As you sink deeper into this darkness, something extraordinary begins to unfold. The very consciousness that seemed to be dissolving reveals itself to be indestructible. Not the small consciousness of the ego, but the vast awareness that witnesses even the ego's apparent death. This is what Jung called the self with a capital S, that transpersonal center which remains constant even as all personal identity crumbles away. Here, in the depths of the abyss, you discover that what you took to be yourself was merely a temporary constellation of thoughts, feelings, and memories, a beautiful but impermanent formation in the ocean of consciousness, like a wave that believes it is separate from the sea. The terror of dissolution gives way to the profound relief of homecoming, as you recognize that you were never truly separate from the source that is now embracing you. This recognition does not come through thinking or analysis. The mind, that faithful servant of the ego, finds itself completely disoriented in this space where logic holds no sway. Instead, the knowing emerges from a deeper faculty, what the traditions have called gnosis or direct spiritual insight. It is the soul's own capacity to recognize its essential nature, even when stripped of all the familiar clothes of personality and circumstance. The void speaks in silence, and its silence contains more wisdom than all the words ever spoken. It teaches without teaching, revealing the fundamental truth that consciousness is not produced by the brain or limited by the body, but is the very fabric of existence itself. What seemed like personal awareness dissolves back into its source, only to be reborn as something infinitely vaster and more mysterious. In this space of not knowing, the usual categories of experience collapse into meaninglessness. Past and future dissolve into an eternal present that contains all time. Self and other merge into a unity that transcends all duality. Sacred and profane reveal themselves as arbitrary distinctions in the face of a reality that is wholly sacred precisely because it embraces everything, even what appears to be profane. The alchemists understood this phase of the work with profound precision. They knew that before the gold of enlightened consciousness could emerge, everything base and artificial had to be dissolved in the universal solvent of the void. They called this stage the massa confusa, the confused mass that remains when all false structures have been broken down. Yet they also knew that this apparent chaos contained within itself the seed of a new and more authentic order. This is why they depicted the Nigredo not as mere destruction, but as a return to the prima materia, the first matter from which all creation springs. In psychological terms, the dissolution of the ego's rigid structures creates space for the spontaneous emergence of the self, that deeper organizing principle which seeks not to control life, but to dance with it in perfect harmony. As consciousness descends into this darkness, it encounters what Jung called the transcendent function, that mysterious capacity of the psyche to bridge opposites and birth new possibilities from their union. The void itself becomes the sacred marriage chamber where all polarities dissolve into their essential unity. Here, being and non-being, fullness and emptiness, life and death reveal themselves as different faces of the same ultimate mystery. The experience of this sacred emptiness often manifests as a profound sense of disorientation in the ordinary world. The roles that once provided meaning seem hollow and artificial. The goals that once motivated action appear as illusions chasing illusions. The very fabric of consensus reality begins to feel like a thin veneer over something infinitely more vast and mysterious. This is not pathology but awakening, the soul's recognition that it has been living in a kind of waking dream. Yet this recognition brings with it a peculiar form of suffering, not the clean pain of physical injury or emotional loss, but the strange ache of being suspended between worlds, no longer able to fully believe in the ego's constructions, but not yet established in the deeper reality that is beginning to reveal itself. This is the liminal space that anthropologists call betwixt and between, where the old self has died but the new has not yet been born. In this pregnant pause, consciousness learns to tolerate ambiguity in ways the ego never could. The need for certainty, for clear categories and definite answers, relaxes into a more feminine mode of being that can hold paradox without demanding resolution. This is not passive acceptance, but active receptivity, the soul's willingness to be impregnated by mystery rather than insisting on understanding everything through the limited lens of rational thought. The void teaches patience of the most profound sort, not the patience of waiting for something to happen, but the patience of allowing what is already happening to unfold in its own mysterious rhythm. Here, in this space beyond time, consciousness learns that the deepest transformations cannot be hurried or controlled, but only midwifed with the most delicate attention and trust. As you abide in this darkness, you begin to understand why so many spiritual traditions have emphasized the necessity of this descent. The mystics knew that enlightenment is not an ascension away from the darkness, but a descent into it so complete that one emerges on the other side, transformed beyond recognition. The hero's journey always leads through the underworld, not because suffering is valuable in itself, but because only in the depths can we discover what in us is truly indestructible. This is the great secret that the void whispers to those brave enough to enter its embrace. What you took to be death is actually birth. What appears as ending is actually beginning. What feels like loss is actually the discovery of what was never lost. The consciousness that descends into this darkness emerges as something new, yet ancient, transformed yet somehow more itself than it has ever been. The sacred void is not a place, but a process, not a destination, but a doorway. It is the space where all false certainties dissolve, making room for a deeper knowing to emerge. It is the darkness that reveals light to be not the opposite of shadow, but its ultimate fulfillment. It is the silence that shows sound to be not the absence of stillness, but its most intimate expression. In surrendering to this sacred nothingness, consciousness discovers its own infinite nature. The wave realizes it is the ocean. The flame recognizes it is the fire. The thought understands it is the mind that thinks it. What seemed like individual awareness expands into the universal awareness that was always its true identity, and what felt like personal dissolution reveals itself as cosmic integration. This is the gift of the abyss, not annihilation but recognition, not death but transfiguration. In losing everything you thought you were, you discover everything you truly are. In surrendering to the void, you are filled with the fullness that was always your deepest nature, waiting patiently for the ego to exhaust its strategies of avoidance so that the soul could finally come home to itself. When the ego's carefully constructed dams begin to crack and crumble, something ancient and unstoppable stirs in the depths of being. The emotional waters that have been held back for years, sometimes decades, behind walls of control and propriety, begin to seep through the fractures, and then, suddenly, catastrophically, magnificently, those walls give way entirely. What follows is not mere feeling, but the return of the emotional body to its wild and natural state, like rivers reclaiming their ancient course after the breaking of an artificial dam. This is the flood that every soul must face on its journey toward authenticity, the overwhelming surge of all that was suppressed, denied, pushed down, and locked away in the name of being civilized, acceptable, manageable. The ego, that master architect of emotional containment, finds itself utterly helpless as decades of unfelt feelings rise from the depths like some primordial tsunami, carrying with them the sediment of every unexpressed joy, every swallowed tear, every rage that was deemed too dangerous to feel. You stand now at the mercy of these sacred storms, and every instinct trained by years of emotional conditioning screams at you to rebuild the dams, to regain control, to somehow stem this tide of raw feeling that threatens to sweep away everything you thought you knew about yourself. But this flood cannot be contained by will alone, nor should it be. For this is not the chaos it appears to be, but the soul's own cleansing process, the psyche's way of washing away the accumulated debris of unlived life and revealing the clear bedrock of authentic being that lies beneath. The intensity can be overwhelming. Emotions that the ego learned to keep in neat, separate compartments now merge and swirl together in ways that defy all rational understanding. Joy and grief become indistinguishable, flowing together like waters finding their natural level. Love and rage dance together in patterns that would have terrified the controlled self. Yet here they reveal themselves as complementary forces in the soul's vast emotional symphony. Ecstasy and terror embrace each other as old lovers reunited, showing the artificial nature of the boundaries the mind had drawn between them. This is what Jung understood as the return of the emotional function to its natural wholeness. The feeling nature, when freed from the ego's need to categorize and judge, reveals its true purpose, not to be managed or controlled, but to be lived, experienced, allowed to flow through the body and being like blood through veins or breath through lungs. Emotion, in its root meaning, is energy in motion, and what you are experiencing is the restoration of this natural movement after years of artificial stillness. Each wave that crashes through your being carries with it the memory of some moment when feeling was frozen, some instant when the natural expression of the soul was deemed inappropriate, dangerous, or simply too much for others to bear. The little girl's uninhibited laughter that was shushed into silence, the young man's tears that were mocked into hiding, the lover's passion that was deemed too intense, the artist's ecstasy that was dismissed as impractical. All of these return now with their full force intact, demanding to be finally, fully felt. But this is not merely personal healing, though it manifests through personal experience. This flood connects you to the collective emotional body of humanity itself. That vast ocean of feeling that flows beneath all individual experience like an underground river system connecting every human heart. As your personal dams collapse, you begin to feel not only your own suppressed emotions, but the accumulated grief and joy of generations, the unexpressed love and rage of entire cultures, the collective shadow of a civilization that has forgotten how to feel. The terror in this recognition is matched only by its profound relief. For in discovering that your pain is not yours alone, that your joy connects you to the universal celebration of existence, that your anger carries the righteous fire of all those who have suffered injustice, you realize that you have never been as isolated as the ego believed. The flood that seemed to threaten your individual existence reveals itself as the return to the emotional communion that is your birthright as a feeling being. Ancient wisdom traditions understood this phase of the journey with remarkable precision. The Hindu concept of rasa speaks of emotions not as personal disturbances, but as cosmic flavors to be tasted and savored in their full intensity. The tantric traditions recognized that the suppression of any feeling diminishes the capacity for all feeling, and that the path to enlightenment leads not around emotion but directly through its center. Even the seemingly austere Buddhist teachings acknowledge the necessity of fully experiencing suffering before it can be transcended. As you allow yourself to be carried by these emotional currents, something remarkable begins to unfold. The feelings that seemed so overwhelming when resisted reveal their hidden gifts when fully embraced. Grief opens the heart to depths of compassion you never knew existed. Anger ignites the sacred fire of discrimination, burning away what is false and illuminating what is true. Fear strips away all pretense and returns you to the naked honesty of the present moment. Joy explodes through every cell, revealing the ecstatic nature of existence itself. This is the alchemical wisdom encoded in the emotional flood, that every feeling, when fully experienced rather than judged or controlled, transmutes into some form of higher awareness. The lead of raw emotion transforms into the gold of conscious feeling, not through suppression or sublimation, but through complete and unconditional acceptance. The energy that was trapped in resistance is liberated to fuel the soul's evolution toward greater wholeness and authentic expression. The process is rarely linear or predictable. Emotions arise in waves, sometimes gentle and sometimes overwhelming, following rhythms that the rational mind cannot anticipate or control. One moment you may find yourself sobbing with a grief so profound it seems to reach back to the beginning of time itself, and the next moment laughing with a joy so pure it rivals the delight of children discovering snow for the first time. The ego's need for emotional consistency reveals itself as one of its most limiting demands, as the soul learns to surf the natural fluctuations of its own feeling nature. In these sacred storms, you begin to understand that the feminine principle within consciousness, what Jung called the anima in men and recognized as the receptive wisdom in women, has been starving for acknowledgement and expression. The flood represents the return of the feeling function to its rightful place, as co-equal with thinking, sensing, and intuition in the fully integrated psyche. No longer relegated to the status of inconvenient distraction or dangerous irrationality, emotion reclaims its role as one of the soul's primary ways of knowing and navigating reality. The body becomes the temple where these emotional mysteries are celebrated and resolved. Years of holding of muscular tension maintained to keep feelings at bay begin to release as the tissues themselves remember their capacity for authentic expression. Breath deepens, movement becomes more fluid, the face relaxes into expressions that have been forbidden since childhood. The body, freed from its role as emotional prison, remembers its true function as the sacred vessel through which the soul experiences and expresses its full range of being. Yet this is not emotional indulgence or the ego's demand for dramatic expression. There is a profound difference between the ego's histrionic display of feeling and the soul's authentic emotional experience. The ego uses emotion to manipulate, control, or draw attention to itself. The soul simply allows feeling to arise, be fully experienced, and naturally transform into whatever comes next. One is performance, the other is surrender. One seeks to get something from others, the other gives expression to what is already full within itself. As the flood continues, you learn to distinguish between emotions that arise from present moment experience and those that emerge from the storehouse of the past. Both are sacred, both deserve honor and attention, but they require different forms of witness. Present moment feelings call for full embodied presence and appropriate response. Historical emotions, the backlog of unprocessed experience, need the spacious witnessing that allows them to complete their natural cycle of arising, intensifying, and releasing. This teaches a new form of patience, not the patience of endurance, but the patience of accompaniment. You learn to be present with your own feeling nature, the way a skilled midwife attends a birth, alert but not controlling, helpful but not interfering, trusting the natural wisdom of the process while remaining available to provide whatever support is truly needed. This is the difference between managing emotions and stewarding them, between controlling feelings and shepherding them toward their natural completion and transformation. The flood also reveals the interconnected nature of the emotional and spiritual dimensions of existence. As suppressed feelings rise to consciousness, they often carry with them profound spiritual insights that had been trapped beneath layers of emotional numbness. The grief that seemed merely personal opens into compassion for all suffering beings. The anger that felt so individual transforms into righteous clarity about justice and truth. The joy that appeared selfish expands into celebration of the divine presence that animates all life. In this way, the emotional flood becomes a form of involuntary spiritual practice, a forced intimacy with the sacred dimensions of human experience that the ego's defenses had successfully kept at bay. You discover that feelings are not obstacles to spiritual development, but doorways into deeper communion with the mystery of existence. The heart, when allowed to feel fully, reveals itself as an organ of spiritual perception, no less sophisticated than the mind's capacity for thought or the body's ability to sense. This recognition brings with it a fundamental shift in how you relate to the entirety of human experience. The emotional life, so long relegated to the realm of personal psychology, reveals its cosmic significance. Your individual feelings are revealed as unique expressions of universal emotional currents that flow through all sentient beings. Your personal healing becomes inseparable from the healing of the collective emotional body of humanity. Your individual journey toward emotional wholeness contributes to the evolution of consciousness itself. As the immediate intensity of the flood begins to stabilize into new patterns of emotional flow, you find yourself fundamentally changed. Not because the difficult feelings have disappeared, they remain available when appropriate, but because your relationship to all feeling has been transformed. Where once there was resistance, now there is receptivity. Where once there was judgment, now there is curiosity. Where once there was fear of being overwhelmed, now there is trust in your own capacity to feel fully without losing your essential stability. The ego's emotional dams, once rebuilt, are now constructed with gates and spillways that allow for the natural flow of feeling without the dangerous accumulation of pressure that leads to destructive flooding. You learn to live as an emotional watershed, allowing feelings to arise, flow through, and find their natural outlets without damming them up behind walls of should and shouldn't, appropriate and inappropriate, acceptable and forbidden. This is the gift of the flood, not the elimination of feeling, but the restoration of feeling to its natural state of flow and transformation. In allowing yourself to be carried by these sacred storms, you discover that the soul's emotional nature is not a force to be conquered, but a river to be honored, not a chaos to be controlled, but a dynamic system seeking its own perfect balance between fullness and emptiness, intensity and peace, expression and rest. In the aftermath of dissolution and emotional flood, something magnificent and mysterious begins to stir in the ruins of the ego's rigid fortress. Where once there stood impermeable walls between this and that, good and evil, masculine and feminine, light and shadow. Now there emerges a sacred space, a temple not built by human hands, where the most ancient of ceremonies can finally unfold. This is the hieros gamos, the sacred marriage, that the alchemists knew as the ultimate goal of their great work, the union of opposites that creates not compromise, but transcendence. You stand now as witness to this cosmic wedding, this fundamental reconciliation of forces that the ego's dualistic vision had convinced you were eternal enemies. Here, in the space cleared by dissolution and cleansed by emotional truth, the polarities that once tore you apart begin to recognize each other as complementary aspects of a greater wholeness, not opponents in some eternal war, but dance partners in the cosmic choreography of existence itself. The marriage begins tentatively, like lovers who have been separated by misunderstanding and must relearn the delicate art of trust. The masculine principle within you, that solar force of action, penetration, analysis, and directed will, extends its hand hesitantly toward the feminine principle that has been so long banished to the unconscious depths. The feminine, that lunar wisdom of receptivity, intuition, gestation, and cyclical flow, emerges from her exile like a queen returning to reclaim her rightful throne. This is not the marriage of man and woman in the external world, though it may profoundly affect how you relate to the opposite sex. This is the far more fundamental union of the masculine and feminine principles within your own psyche, what Jung called the animus and anima, those contrasexual aspects of the personality that must be integrated for individuation to occur. For too long, consciousness has been ruled by the tyranny of the masculine ego, relegating feminine wisdom to the realm of the unconscious, where it could only express itself through symptoms, projections, and the mysterious workings of fate. In this sacred marriage chamber of transformed consciousness, you begin to witness the delicate negotiations between these long estranged lovers. The masculine, accustomed to conquest and control, must learn the art of courtship, how to woo wisdom rather than demand it, how to invite insight rather than force understanding. The feminine, wounded by centuries of suppression and violation, must learn to trust again, to emerge from her protective hiddenness and offer her gifts not as submission but as sovereign choice. Watch how they circle each other in this ancient dance of recognition. The masculine offers his gifts, his clarity of vision, his capacity for decisive action, his ability to focus energy toward specific goals. But now these offerings come without the arrogance that once poisoned them, tempered by the humility that dissolution taught and the emotional intelligence that the flood awakened. He no longer seeks to possess or dominate, but to serve the greater wholeness that their union will create. The feminine responds by gradually unveiling her mysteries, her capacity to hold paradox without needing resolution, her ability to perceive the invisible connections between all things, her power to create life through patient gestation rather than forceful manifestation. But these gifts are no longer offered from a position of weakness or subservience. They come from the deep authority of one who knows her own worth, who understands that receptivity is not passivity, but the most profound form of creative power. This inner marriage transforms your relationship to every polarity that once seemed irreconcilable. Light and shadow begin their courtship dance, and you discover that what you called evil was often simply unintegrated power. What you labeled as darkness was frequently wisdom that your light-obsessed ego was too immature to receive. The shadow, that repository of everything the ego deemed unacceptable about itself, emerges not as monster but as the dark lover whose embrace makes wholeness possible. You learn to witness the shadow's gifts without being possessed by them. The anger you once feared becomes the sacred fire that burns away what is false. The selfishness you so carefully suppressed reveals itself as healthy self-care and appropriate boundaries. The wildness you tamed becomes the creative force that breaks through the calcified patterns of conventional existence. Even what seemed like cruelty or destructiveness shows its hidden face as necessary aspects of the natural cycles of death and renewal that govern all life. But this is not naive integration that glosses over real differences or pretends that all polarities are equal. The marriage of opposites does not create moral relativism or spiritual bypassing. Instead, it births a higher form of discrimination, the ability to discern when each pole is appropriate, when to apply masculine focus and when to trust feminine flow, when to embrace the light and when to honor the darkness, when to act decisively and when to wait in patient receptivity. This is the wisdom of enantiodromia, Jung's term for the psychological law that governs the natural tendency of things to transform into their opposites. What the ego experienced as bewildering reversals, moments when strength became weakness, when certainty dissolved into doubt, when love transformed into rage, the integrated consciousness recognizes as the natural breathing of existence itself. The pendulum swings not to torment you, but to teach you the rhythm of wholeness. In this sacred marriage, you begin to understand why the mystics spoke of coincidentia oppositorum, the coincidence of opposites that characterizes divine consciousness. God, they realized, could not be found in choosing sides, but only in the space that embraces all sides, not as compromise, but as transcendence. The divine nature includes and transcends every polarity, not by eliminating differences, but by revealing the underlying unity that makes differences possible. Your relationship to your own gender begins to transform as this inner marriage unfolds. If you are a man, you discover that true masculinity is not threatened by feminine wisdom, but strengthened by it, that the warrior's power is enhanced rather than diminished when wedded to the receptive intelligence of the inner feminine. If you are a woman, you find that authentic femininity need not reject masculine qualities of focus and direction, but can embrace them as allies in the service of your deeper creative purposes. This integration ripples outward into your relationships with others. No longer do you seek your missing half in another person. No longer do you project your unlived masculine or feminine potential onto partners and demand that they complete you. Instead, you come to relationship as a whole, being capable of dancing with the wholeness of another, meeting them not from neediness but from fullness, not from projection but from recognition. The marriage of opposites also transforms your relationship to the eternal questions that have puzzled humanity since consciousness first awakened to its own existence. The seeming contradictions between free will and determinism, between individual significance and cosmic meaninglessness, between time and eternity, between love and death. All of these begin to reveal themselves not as problems to be solved, but as koans to be lived, creative tensions that generate the very energy of existence itself. You discover that what appeared as either-or choices were false dilemmas created by the ego's need for simplified categories. Life, you begin to understand, operates according to the logic of both and rather than either-or. You can be both utterly unique and completely connected to the universal. You can be both mortally vulnerable and eternally indestructible. You can be both fully human and touched by the divine. These are not contradictions, but complementary truths that reveal the multidimensional nature of existence itself. The alchemical texts spoke of this union as the creation of the hermaphrodite, the androgynous being who contains both masculine and feminine principles in perfect balance. But this is not some literal physical transformation. It is the birth of consciousness that no longer needs to choose between its various aspects, but can fluidly embody whatever qualities the situation demands. This is psychological wholeness, not the elimination of differences, but their harmonious integration in service of a greater purpose. In this integration, you begin to taste what the Eastern traditions call non-dual awareness, consciousness that no longer divides reality into subject and object, self and other, sacred and profane. Yet this is not the elimination of distinctions, but their recognition as play, as the divine comedy in which the one appears to fragment itself into multiplicity for the sheer joy of the dance, only to rediscover its unity through the very differences it has created. The sacred marriage within your own being becomes a template for how you engage with all the polarities of existence. Instead of being pulled apart by competing loyalties and contradictory desires, you learn to hold space for the full spectrum of your nature. You can be both serious about spiritual development and playful about the cosmic joke of it all. You can be both committed to personal growth and relaxed about outcomes. You can be both engaged with the world and detached from its dramas. This is what Jung meant by holding the tension of opposites, not as a static balance, but as a dynamic dance, a constant creative flow between poles that generates new possibilities. The energy that was once trapped in inner conflict is liberated to serve the soul's greater purpose. What felt like being torn apart reveals itself as being woven together into a more complex and beautiful pattern. The mystical marriage also heals the ancient split between matter and spirit, body and soul, earth and heaven. These two were false divisions created by a consciousness that had forgotten its essential unity. In the integrated awareness, you discover that matter is spirit slowed down to the point of visibility, that the body is the temple where the soul offers its worship, that earth is heaven learning to dance with gravity and time. This recognition transforms your relationship to the physical world. No longer do you need to escape the body to find the divine. No longer do you have to reject the material to embrace the spiritual. Instead, you learn to see every physical experience as a spiritual opportunity, every sensual pleasure as a form of communion, every embodied challenge as an invitation to deeper integration. The marriage of opposites within you becomes a living demonstration of the fundamental principle that governs all existence, that unity expresses itself through diversity, that the one becomes the many without ceasing to be one, that love discovers itself by appearing to separate from itself and then recognizing itself in the other. Your individual journey toward wholeness becomes part of the cosmic process, by which consciousness awakens to its own nature through the apparent multiplicity of individual beings. As this sacred union stabilizes within your being, you find yourself naturally becoming a bridge between worlds, a translator of opposing languages, a peacemaker in the wars between polarities, not because you have eliminated conflict, but because you have discovered the creative potential that lies hidden within every apparent contradiction. You become a living symbol of the possibility that all opposites can be married, that every division can be healed, that wholeness is not only possible, but is the deepest truth about the nature of existence itself. In the quiet aftermath of the mystical marriage, as the dust settles from the cosmic wedding of opposites within your being, something profound and transformative begins to emerge from the depths, something that has been absent from human consciousness for so long that we have almost forgotten what wholeness looks like. Like the first light of dawn after the longest night, the feminine principle begins her return from the exile where masculine-dominated consciousness has banished her for millennia. This is not merely psychological healing, though it manifests through the healing of your individual psyche. This is the return of an entire dimension of being that civilization itself has systematically suppressed in its rush toward conquest, control, and linear progress. The feminine, not as gender but as cosmic principle, emerges from her underground kingdom like Persephone returning from the underworld, carrying with her the accumulated wisdom of her long journey through the darkness of collective unconsciousness. You feel her presence first as a subtle shift in the quality of your awareness, a softening where there was once hardness, a flowing where there was once rigidity, a patient receptivity where there was once anxious grasping. The ego's constant need to push, to strive, to make things happen begins to relax into something far more mysterious and ultimately more powerful. The capacity to allow, to receive, to be so completely present that life itself begins to offer its gifts without being forced or coerced. This is perhaps the most radical teaching the returning feminine brings, that receptivity is not passivity, but the most sophisticated form of power imaginable. Watch how the earth receives the seed, not as empty vessel waiting to be filled, but as conscious creative force that knows exactly how to transform that small offering into towering trees and abundant harvests. Observe how the silence receives the sound, not as mere absence, but as the pregnant space that makes music possible, the conscious emptiness that gives meaning to every note. The feminine principle teaches that being is not less valuable than doing, that stillness is not laziness, but the source from which all meaningful action springs, that waiting is not wasted time, but the gestation period during which invisible transformations prepare to birth themselves into visible form. She reveals receptivity as a form of genius, the ability to sense what wants to emerge and to provide exactly the conditions it needs to flourish. As this understanding penetrates deeper into your consciousness, you begin to recognize how profoundly the overemphasis on masculine values has impoverished your relationship to life itself. The constant pressure to produce, to achieve, to make your mark upon the world has created a kind of spiritual exhaustion, a depletion that no amount of rest can heal because it stems not from physical tiredness but from the soul's malnourishment in a culture that has forgotten how to nourish itself at the feminine sources of renewal. The returning feminine brings with her the lost arts of receptive intelligence. She teaches you how to listen not just with your ears but with your entire being, how to sense the subtle currents of energy that flow beneath the surface of ordinary experience, how to read the signs and synchronicities that reveal the deeper patterns connecting all things. This is not mystical fantasy but practical wisdom, the kind of knowing that indigenous peoples cultivated for thousands of years before the modern world convinced itself that only what could be measured and manipulated was real. Under her influence, intuition begins to emerge from its hiding place behind the fortress walls of rational thought. Not as enemy of reason, but as its long-lost sister, intuition reveals itself as another way of knowing, immediate, holistic, capable of grasping the essence of complex situations in a single flash of insight that might take linear thinking hours to analyze and understand. you discover that you have been living with only half your intelligence engaged, relying solely on the masculine faculty of focused analysis, while ignoring the feminine gift of pattern recognition and systemic perception. The feminine principle also restores the sacred dimension of cyclical time. The masculine consciousness that has dominated our era worships linear progress, the straight line from here to there, the ladder of achievement, the arrow of time that never returns to where it started. But the feminine knows the wisdom of circles, spirals, seasons. She understands that growth happens not through endless forward motion, but through deepening, not through constant climbing, but through patient ripening, not through conquering new territory, but through fully inhabiting the ground where you already stand. This shift from linear to cyclical awareness transforms your relationship to your own development. No longer do you judge yourself harshly for seeming to revisit old patterns or return to familiar themes. Instead, you recognize that consciousness evolves like a spiral, returning to the same territories but at deeper levels, encountering the same questions but with greater capacity to hold their complexity and paradox. What looked like regression from the linear perspective reveals itself as integration from the cyclical viewpoint. The returning feminine also brings with her a profound respect for the natural rhythms of expansion and contraction, activity and rest, speaking and silence. She teaches that the exhale is as important as the inhale, that winter serves life as much as summer, that the spaces between the notes are as essential as the notes themselves. Under her influence, you begin to honor your own natural cycles instead of fighting them, learning to work with your energy rather than against it. This is particularly revolutionary in a culture that demands constant availability, perpetual productivity, endless growth. The feminine principle whispers the radical truth that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is nothing, not as laziness but as conscious non-action, not as withdrawal but as receptive presence that allows life to reorganize itself around your stillness. She teaches the art of fertile emptiness, pregnant silence, creative receptivity that births new possibilities without force or struggle. As the feminine reclaims her rightful place in your consciousness, you begin to discover the hidden power of vulnerability. The ego's masculine armor, its need to appear strong, invulnerable, always in control, begins to soften, revealing vulnerability not as weakness, but as the courage to remain open in the face of an uncertain and sometimes painful world. You learn that it takes far more strength to stay tender than to build walls, more courage to love than to defend, more power to trust than to control. This vulnerability opens you to deeper intimacy with life itself, where the armored ego could only touch the surface of experience, always maintaining some defensive distance. The vulnerable heart can receive the full impact of beauty, sorrow, joy, and mystery. You discover that what you thought was protection was actually isolation, that what you believed was strength was actually a form of numbness that cut you off from the very experiences that make existence meaningful. The feminine principle also restores the sacred art of holding space, not the passive holding that merely endures, but the active holding that creates sanctuary for transformation to occur. Like the mother who can hold her child's pain without trying to fix it, without being overwhelmed by it, you learn to hold the pain and joy of your own becoming with the same spacious presence. This is perhaps the feminine's greatest gift, the capacity to be with what is without needing to change it, to witness without judgment, to love without condition. Under her influence, your relationship to your own body begins to transform. The masculine ego often treats the body as a machine to be optimized, a vehicle to be driven, a territory to be conquered and controlled. But the feminine knows the body as temple, as wise animal, as the earth element through which spirit learns to dance with matter. She teaches you to listen to the body's intelligence, to honor its needs and rhythms, to treat it as sacred partner rather than mere possession. This embodied presence transforms how you move through the world. No longer rushing toward some future goal, you begin to inhabit each moment more fully. No longer trying to escape discomfort through distraction, you learn to breathe with whatever arises. No longer postponing joy until conditions are perfect, you discover the fierce presence that can find beauty even in the midst of difficulty. The returning feminine also awakens what Jung called the transcendent function, the psyche's capacity to hold opposing truths simultaneously without collapsing them into false synthesis. She teaches the art of both and thinking. The wisdom that knows truth is often found not in choosing between alternatives, but in discovering the higher perspective that embraces apparent contradictions. This is the intelligence of paradox, the genius that can love someone while setting boundaries with them, that can be fully committed while remaining unattached to outcomes. As this feminine consciousness stabilizes within your being, you find yourself becoming a different kind of presence in the world. Less driven by the need to prove yourself, you become more naturally magnetic. Less focused on getting, you become more capable of giving. Less concerned with being right, you become more interested in being real. The frantic energy of the ego-seeking validation gives way to the natural radiance of being that has nothing to prove because it knows its own worth. This transformation inevitably affects your relationships. No longer seeking to complete yourself through others, you come to relationship from wholeness rather than neediness. No longer trying to control or change your partners, you create space for them to be authentically themselves. The feminine principle teaches that love's highest expression is not possession but appreciation, not merger but recognition, not dependency but interdependence. In your relationship to creativity, the feminine brings a revolutionary understanding, where the masculine approach to creation emphasizes will, effort, and forcing breakthrough. The feminine reveals creativity as a collaborative dance between consciousness and the mystery from which all inspiration springs. She teaches that the artist's job is not to create ex nihilo, but to become so receptive that what wants to be born can emerge through them. This is why so many artists speak of their best work coming through them rather than from them. The feminine also restores the lost connection between creativity and fertility, between art and life-giving. She reveals that all authentic creation is, in some sense, birth, the bringing forth of something new from the unknown depths of being. This understanding transforms creative work from ego achievement into sacred service, from personal expression into participation in the cosmic creativity that continuously births new forms from the formless source. As the feminine reclaims her throne in your consciousness, you begin to understand why her return is so essential, not just for individual healing, but for the healing of our entire civilization. The purely masculine approach to progress, based on domination, exploitation, and endless expansion, has brought our species to the brink of ecological and social collapse. Only by wedding masculine clarity and focus with feminine wisdom and receptivity can we find our way forward. This is not about the superiority of feminine over masculine, but about the restoration of balance, the return to the sacred marriage that makes wholeness possible. The feminine does not seek to dominate but to complement, not to replace masculine virtues but to wed them to their neglected feminine partners. Strength wedded to tenderness, courage married to compassion, will united with wisdom, action balanced by receptivity. In your own life, this balance manifests as a new way of being that honors both doing and being, both achieving and receiving, both speaking your truth and listening to the truth of others. You become a living demonstration that power need not be dominating to be effective, that strength can be gentle without being weak, that leadership can be service and service can be leadership. There comes a moment in the depths of dissolution when something unprecedented begins to stir, not the familiar movements of the ego attempting to reassemble itself, not the old patterns reaching desperately for familiar ground, but something altogether new, something that has been waiting beneath the surface of consciousness, like a seed buried in winter earth, patient and eternal. This is the phoenix birth, the sacred emergence that Jung recognized as the appearance of the self, that deeper identity that encompasses but transcends everything we once believed ourselves to be. It rises not from the preservation of what we were, but from the complete acceptance of what we are no longer. The flames that consumed our old identity become the very womb from which our true nature is born. Listen carefully to this mystery. What emerges is not a resurrection of the ego, but a revelation of what was always present beneath its elaborate constructions. The self does not arrive from somewhere else. It reveals itself as the ground that was always there, the awareness that witnessed even our deepest forgetting. Like the phoenix, this new being carries within its wings the wisdom of both death and birth, having journeyed through complete dissolution to discover what cannot be destroyed. The ego, in its final throes of dissolution, often experiences this emergence as invasion, as if some foreign force were taking possession of its sacred territory. But this is the last illusion, the final trick of identification. What feels like invasion is actually homecoming, the return of consciousness to its true residence after a long exile in the narrow chambers of personal identity. Watch how this birth unfolds. There is no violence in it, no conquest or domination. The self emerges with the gentle inevitability of dawn breaking over a landscape that seemed forever lost to darkness. It does not push the ego aside, but encompasses it, the way a vast sky contains a small cloud without effort or strain. The ego's dramatic importance dissolves not through force, but through perspective, the way a candle's significance changes when the sun rises. This is perhaps the most profound reversal in human consciousness, the moment when we realize that what we took to be the center of our being was actually the periphery, and what we had relegated to the unconscious depths was actually the vast expanse of our true nature. The ego doesn't disappear. It finds its rightful place as servant rather than master of a consciousness far vaster than it ever imagined. Jung called this the enantiodromia, the running toward the opposite, where extreme ego death transforms into extreme self-realization. But it is not truly opposite, it is revelation. The death reveals what was always deathless. The dissolution shows what was always whole. The emptiness demonstrates what was always full. In this sacred birth, memory takes on an entirely different quality. The past is not erased, but transformed from prison into wisdom. Every wound becomes a doorway through which compassion enters. Every mistake becomes a teacher pointing toward what is true. Every moment of suffering reveals itself as preparation for this awakening, like labor pains that seemed meaningless until the child is born. The phoenix does not rise despite the fire, but because of it. Every flame that consumed the false self was necessary. Every ash that remained was holy. Nothing was wasted, nothing was meaningless. Even the resistance to dissolution served its purpose, creating the very tension that makes emergence possible. The ego's desperate fight for survival was itself part of the sacred process, the way a butterfly must struggle against the chrysalis to develop the strength needed for flight. But this birth is unlike any other. What emerges is not separate from its source, but is the source recognizing itself. The self that is born was never truly absent. It was the space in which all experience occurred, the awareness that made even forgetting possible. This is the great joke, the cosmic humor that often accompanies awakening. We spent so much energy seeking what we already were, traveling so far to arrive where we had never left. The quality of this new consciousness is utterly different from ego consciousness. Where the ego grasped, the self receives. Where the ego defended, the self embraces. Where the ego separated, the self connects. It is not that the self is better than the ego. It is that the self is the context in which the ego can finally find peace. This emergence often brings with it a quality Jung called the transcendent function, the ability to hold opposites without choosing sides, to contain paradox without resolving it into comfort. The self that is born from ego death knows itself as both individual and universal, both personal and impersonal, both human and divine. It has the remarkable capacity to be fully engaged with life while remaining utterly unattached to outcomes. Watch how this manifests in the most ordinary moments. Making tea becomes a sacred act not because we make it sacred, but because sacredness reveals itself as the true nature of all action. Washing dishes becomes meditation, not through effort, but through recognition. Walking becomes prayer, not because we pray while walking, but because walking itself is discovered to be prayer. The phoenix birth brings with it what the mystics have always called beginner's mind, the capacity to meet each moment as if for the first time, free from the accumulated weight of past interpretation. The self looks upon the world with eyes that have never seen, touches reality with hands that have never grasped, loves with a heart that has never been broken because it was never separate enough from love to be damaged by love's apparent absence. This is the sacred initiation that ego death provides, the death of the one who dies and the birth of the one who cannot die. The ego, in its dissolution, offers itself as sacrifice on the altar of truth, and from this willing offering, consciousness is born into its true nature. What seemed like the end of everything becomes the beginning of what was always beginning. The process is both utterly unique to each individual and absolutely universal. Your phoenix will have features that no other phoenix has ever possessed, will sing songs that have never been sung, will carry wisdom that belongs only to your particular journey through dissolution and rebirth. Yet this uniqueness is not separation. It is your specific note in the universal symphony of awakening, your particular color in the infinite spectrum of consciousness. There is often a period of disorientation as this new identity stabilizes. The ego's familiar landmarks are gone, but the self's geography is still being discovered. This is natural and necessary. Like a newborn learning to breathe air instead of water, consciousness must learn new ways of navigating reality from this expanded perspective. During this time, it is common to feel simultaneously incredibly ancient and utterly innocent. Ancient because the self that has emerged is timeless, has always been present, carries the wisdom of the ages. Innocent because this consciousness meets the world without the protective barriers that the ego had constructed, without the elaborate defenses that had become second nature. The phoenix birth also brings what Jung called the religious function of the psyche. Not religion as dogma or belief system, but religion as reconnection, as the lived experience of unity with the source from which consciousness itself arises. This is not a return to childhood faith, but the emergence of mature mysticism, the direct knowing of the sacred that needs no external validation because it is self-evident. This knowing changes everything and nothing. Everything because the context in which life is lived has fundamentally shifted. Nothing because trees are still trees, traffic is still traffic, dishes still need washing, but the one who lives, the one who sees the trees and navigates the traffic and washes the dishes, has undergone a transformation so complete that it amounts to rebirth. The self that emerges from ego death carries within it what Jung called the conjunctio, the marriage of opposites that had seemed irreconcilable from the ego's perspective. Light and dark, joy and sorrow, birth and death, sacred and mundane, all are revealed as aspects of a single reality that the ego's either-or thinking could never encompass. This is perhaps the most practical gift of the phoenix birth, the end of the inner war that had consumed so much energy. The self doesn't have to choose between opposing forces because it is large enough to contain them all. It doesn't have to resolve paradox because it is itself the resolution, not through elimination but through embrace. The emergence is often accompanied by what can only be called a cosmic sense of humor. The same situations that once triggered the ego's elaborate dramas now reveal themselves as divine comedy. Not because suffering isn't real, but because suffering is seen in context, as one movement in a vast dance that includes joy, as one color in a painting that encompasses all colors. This humor is not cynical or detached, but deeply compassionate. The self laughs with the human condition, not at it. It sees the beautiful absurdity of consciousness trying to understand itself, of the infinite playing at being finite, of love hiding from itself so it can have the joy of finding itself again. The phoenix that is born from ego death is not a perfect being, but a complete being. Complete in its willingness to be imperfect, whole in its acceptance of its own fragmentation, divine in its embrace of its humanity. This is the great paradox that only the dissolved ego can understand. Perfection is not the absence of imperfection, but the loving inclusion of all that is. As this new consciousness stabilizes, it begins to recognize that the journey of dissolution and rebirth is not a linear progression, but a spiral dance. Each day offers opportunities for small deaths and small births. Each interaction provides chances to die to old patterns and be born into new responses. The phoenix birth is not a destination, but an ongoing process, a continuous becoming. The self that emerges knows itself as both the journey and the traveler, both the path and the walker, both the death and the rebirth. It has learned the secret that the ego could never grasp, that consciousness is not something you have, but something you are, not something you possess, but something that possesses you, in the most beautiful sense of the word. This birth often brings with it a quality of profound ordinariness. The extraordinary becomes so natural that it seems ordinary. Miracles become so common that they lose their miraculous quality and reveal themselves as the normal functioning of consciousness when it is not obscured by ego identification. The sacred is everywhere because the one who sees is itself sacred. The phoenix rises not in defiance of death, but in celebration of it. Death is revealed as the constant companion of life, not its enemy, but its dance partner. Every moment something dies, a thought, a breath, an identity, and every moment something is born. The self that emerges from ego death knows itself as both the dying and the being born, both the flame and the phoenix. This is the sacred initiation that awaits every human consciousness, the willingness to die completely to what we think we are so that we may be born into what we actually are. The ego's death is not defeat, but victory, the victory of truth over illusion, of wholeness over fragmentation, of love over fear. And in this birth, the greatest secret is revealed. There was never anyone to save and no one to be saved. There was only consciousness, playing at being lost so it could experience the joy of finding itself, playing at being separate so it could discover its unity, playing at being mortal so it could remember its deathless nature. The phoenix birth is humanity's greatest gift to itself, the proof that no matter how complete the dissolution, no matter how thorough the ego death, consciousness itself cannot be destroyed. It can only be revealed in ever greater beauty, ever deeper truth, ever more expansive love. This is the initiation we are all approaching, whether we know it or not. The invitation is always present, waiting with infinite patience for the moment when we are ready to release our grip on who we think we are and allow ourselves to be born into who we actually are. The phoenix is always rising. The self is always emerging. The sacred birth is always now. Now comes the most delicate phase of the entire journey, learning to inhabit this new ground of being while still functioning in the world that the ego once navigated with such familiar certainty. This is not the challenge of transcendence, which lifts us above the human condition, but the far more subtle art of integration, which teaches us to live from essential being while maintaining our practical engagement with ordinary reality. The phoenix has been born, but now it must learn to walk upon the earth. The self has emerged from the ashes of ego death, but now it must discover how to pay bills and have conversations and navigate traffic from this vastly expanded perspective. This is the razor's edge of awakened living, remaining grounded in the mundane while accessing the extraordinary depths that ego death has revealed. Listen to this carefully. The challenge is not to remain in some elevated state of consciousness, floating above the concerns of human existence. The challenge is to bring the wisdom of dissolution into the very heart of daily life, to allow the self that has emerged to express itself through the thousand small interactions that make up an ordinary day. The ego, in its dissolution, has revealed its true purpose, not as the tyrant of consciousness, but as its servant, not as the master of identity, but as its humble instrument. The ego that emerges on the other side of death is transformed, chastened, no longer inflated with its own importance, but grateful to serve something infinitely larger than itself. This is perhaps the most profound shift. The ego becomes a useful tool rather than a desperate taskmaster. Like a hammer in the hands of a skilled carpenter, the ego serves the deeper intelligence that has emerged from the dissolution. It handles the practical necessities of human existence, remembering appointments, navigating social conventions, managing the body's needs, while the self provides the context, the awareness, the spacious presence in which all activities unfold. Watch how this manifests in the simplest interactions. When someone asks how you are, the ego provides the socially appropriate response, while the self recognizes the deeper conversation always taking place. Consciousness meeting consciousness, being encountering being. The answer becomes authentic without being inappropriate, truthful without being overwhelming. The art lies in learning to live from two levels simultaneously. On the surface level, life continues with all its apparent concerns and challenges. Bills must be paid, relationships must be navigated, work must be completed. But underneath this surface activity flows the deeper current of essential being, the awareness that all activity arises within consciousness, that all problems are movements within an ultimately problem-free space. This is not detachment, but the deepest form of engagement. The self that has emerged from ego death is not separate from life, but intimately connected to all of life. It experiences each moment more fully than the ego ever could, because it has no separate agenda to defend, no personal agenda that creates resistance to what is happening. Jung understood this as the mature functioning of what he called the transcendent function, the capacity to hold multiple levels of reality simultaneously without collapsing into confusion. The self lives in the world of form, while never forgetting the formless awareness from which all forms arise. It participates fully in the human drama, while never losing sight of the divine comedy in which all dramas are embedded. The practical implications are profound and subtle. Decision-making becomes radically different when it arises from essential being rather than ego protection. Instead of asking, what will advance my interests? The question becomes, what wants to happen here? Instead of manipulating circumstances to serve personal agenda, there is a listening for what life itself is inviting. This is not passivity, but the highest form of action, action that arises from alignment with life's deeper intelligence rather than from ego's limited perspective. The ego's job is to implement what the self perceives, to translate wisdom into practical steps, to serve as the hands and feet of a consciousness that encompasses both individual and universal perspectives. The challenge of integration reveals itself most clearly in relationships. The self that has emerged from ego death relates to others not as separate entities to be manipulated or defended against, but as expressions of the same consciousness that it has discovered itself to be. Yet this recognition must be expressed through the ego's social functions: speaking, listening, responding, engaging. Watch how this transforms even the most ordinary conversations. The ego provides the words, while the self provides the presence. The ego remembers personal history, while the self recognizes eternal patterns. The ego navigates social dynamics, while the self sees the play of consciousness, exploring itself through multiple forms. This dual functioning often creates a period of awkwardness as consciousness learns to operate from this new ground. The ego's old habits of defensiveness, competition, and manipulation no longer serve, but new patterns of authentic relating must be learned. It is like learning to write with your non-dominant hand. The capacity is there, but the coordination must be developed. The workplace becomes a particularly interesting arena for this integration. The self brings to professional activities a quality of presence and clarity that was impossible from the ego's fragmented perspective. Decisions arise from wisdom rather than fear. Creativity flows more freely because there is less to defend, and conflicts resolve more easily because there is no separate agenda creating resistance. Yet this must all be expressed through the ego's practical functions: meeting deadlines, following procedures, communicating with colleagues. The art is to let the self's clarity inform the ego's actions without creating conflict or confusion in professional relationships. Money takes on an entirely different meaning when approached from essential being. The ego's relationship to money was always distorted by concepts of security, status, and survival. The self understands money as energy, as a tool for creative expression and service, as one of many ways that life organizes itself through human consciousness. This doesn't mean becoming careless with money, but rather approaching financial decisions from wisdom rather than fear. The ego still balances the checkbook and pays the bills, but these activities are informed by the self's understanding of abundance as a quality of consciousness rather than a quantity of possessions. The body, too, requires integration. The ego that has died and been reborn has a completely different relationship to physical existence. The body is no longer experienced as separate from consciousness, but as consciousness expressing itself in physical form. This brings both greater care for the body and greater freedom from body identification. Exercise becomes a celebration of embodied awareness, rather than an attempt to perfect or control the physical form. Eating becomes a conscious communion with life, rather than an unconscious habit or emotional compensation. Sleep becomes a willing surrender to the mystery of consciousness, rather than an escape from daily concerns. Perhaps most challenging is learning to navigate the emotional landscape from this new ground. The self that has emerged from ego death still experiences the full range of human emotions, but the relationship to emotions is completely transformed. Emotions are experienced as weather patterns in the sky of consciousness, rather than as threats to identity. The ego learns to feel emotions fully, while the self provides the space in which all feelings can arise and dissolve without drama. Anger is allowed without becoming angry. Sadness is felt without becoming sad. Joy is experienced without becoming attached to joy. This is the profound difference between feeling emotions and being identified with emotions. This emotional maturity often confuses others who are accustomed to the ego's dramatic relationship to feelings. The integrated being appears calm not because they don't feel, but because they feel from such a spacious context that no single emotion can overwhelm the totality of their being. The new ground of essential being also transforms the relationship to time. The ego lived in psychological time, always somewhere else, either regretting the past or anticipating the future. The self lives in eternal time, fully present to the now while aware of the timeless dimension in which all moments arise. This creates a unique relationship to planning and goal setting. The ego still makes appointments and sets intentions, but these activities arise from present moment awareness rather than future-focused anxiety. Plans are held lightly as possibilities rather than requirements. Goals become expressions of current inspiration rather than compensations for current inadequacy. The spiritual dimension of life becomes completely natural rather than separate from ordinary activity. Prayer is not something you do at specific times, but a quality of attention you bring to everything. Meditation is not a practice you perform, but a state of awareness you inhabit. Service is not something you add to your life, but the natural expression of consciousness, recognizing itself in all forms. Yet this must all be integrated with the ego's practical needs. The phone still rings and must be answered. Traffic still flows and must be navigated. Groceries still need to be purchased and bills still need to be paid. The art is to allow these activities to become expressions of the sacred rather than distractions from it. This integration often reveals itself in the quality of attention you bring to seemingly mundane activities. Washing dishes becomes a meditation on the flow of life. Driving becomes a practice of present moment awareness. Working becomes a form of service to the greater whole, of which you now know yourself to be an expression. The razor's edge quality of this integration cannot be overstated. Too much emphasis on the self's transcendent perspective can lead to spiritual bypassing, using spiritual insights to avoid the legitimate concerns of human existence. Too much emphasis on the ego's practical concerns can lead to forgetting the larger context that gives all activity its meaning. The middle way is to honor both levels simultaneously. The self provides the awareness, the ego provides the action. The self recognizes the unity, the ego navigates the multiplicity. The self knows the timeless truth. The ego handles the temporal responsibilities. Neither is rejected. Both are integrated in service of conscious living. This integration is not achieved once and then maintained effortlessly. It is a continuous process of fine-tuning, of learning to balance transcendent awareness with practical engagement. Some days the balance tips too far toward transcendence, and you must consciously engage with the world's concerns. Other days the balance tips too far toward worldly involvement, and you must consciously return to the ground of essential being. The gift of living from this new ground is that life becomes simultaneously more meaningful and less serious. More meaningful because every activity is recognized as an expression of consciousness exploring itself. Less serious because the ego's dramatic interpretations have been replaced by the self's playful recognition of the cosmic joke in which we are all participating. Relationships become deeper because there is no separate self to defend. Yet they also become lighter because there is no desperate need for others to complete what is already whole. Work becomes more creative because it arises from inspiration rather than compulsion. Yet it also becomes more effortless because there is no resistance to what wants to happen. The new ground of essential being reveals itself as not really new at all, but as the original ground that was always there, hidden beneath the ego's elaborate constructions. Integration is really a return to the natural way of being that existed before consciousness became identified with its content. Children often display this natural integration before the ego solidifies into rigid patterns. They live fully in the present moment while remaining open to wonder and mystery. They express emotions authentically without becoming trapped in emotional states. They engage with the world wholeheartedly while maintaining a natural sense of play. The integrated adult has returned to this childlike way of being, but with the wisdom that comes from having journeyed through ego identification and ego death. The innocence is not naive, but mature, earned through experience rather than protected from experience. This is perhaps the greatest gift of integration, the return of natural spontaneity informed by deep wisdom. Actions arise not from calculated self-interest, but from the natural flow of life expressing itself through individual form. Responses come not from defensive patterns, but from creative intelligence meeting each situation freshly. Living from essential being while maintaining practical functionality is humanity's next evolutionary step. It is the bridge between the ego-driven consciousness that has dominated human history and the awakened consciousness that represents our highest potential. Each person who learns to walk this razor's edge contributes to the collective evolution of human awareness. The new ground is not a place you arrive at, but a way of being you cultivate, moment by moment. It is available in this breath, in this heartbeat, in this simple act of attention. The ego death was preparation. The phoenix birth was initiation. Integration is the ongoing practice of living from the truth that was revealed in the flames of dissolution. This is the art of awakened living, to be simultaneously human and divine, temporal and eternal, individual and universal. To let the ego serve the self while the self expresses through the ego. To live from essential being while fully engaging with the beautiful, messy, magnificent complexity of human existence. The razor's edge becomes not a place of precarious balance, but a dance of conscious participation in the mystery of existence itself. This is the new ground, solid as rock because it is founded in truth, fluid as water because it adapts to every circumstance, vast as space because it excludes nothing, intimate as breath because it is the very essence of what you are. Here we arrive at the deepest recognition, the wisdom that transforms everything that has come before, from journey into dance, from process into rhythm, from achievement into flow. The ego dissolution you have experienced, the phoenix birth that emerged from those ashes, the delicate integration of essential being with practical living. All of this was not a destination, but a doorway into understanding life's most fundamental pattern. Ego death is not a one-time event that you survive and then move beyond. It is life's eternal rhythm, the cosmic heartbeat that pulses through every moment of existence. Like seasons cycling through death and renewal, consciousness continuously dies to what it was, to become what it might be. Each breath is a small death and rebirth, each sleep and waking, each ending of a thought and beginning of the next. Listen to this mystery, the great ego death that felt so catastrophic, so final, so complete, was actually an initiation into recognizing the deaths and rebirths that are happening constantly, everywhere, always. Once you have died completely and been reborn into essential being, you begin to see that this dying and being born is the very fabric of existence itself. The mature understanding that emerges from deep ego dissolution is not that you have transcended the cycle of death and rebirth, but that you have learned to flow with it rather than resist it. You have discovered that what you are, the essential being that survived complete ego death, is both the one who dies and the one who is born. both the winter that strips away and the spring that brings forth new life. Watch how this recognition changes everything. The small deaths that occur throughout each day, the end of a conversation, the completion of a project, the disappointment of an expectation, are no longer experienced as losses but as natural movements in consciousness's eternal dance with itself. Each ending becomes pregnant with possibility rather than heavy with grief. This is what Jung meant by the eternal return, not the repetition of the same patterns but the spiral evolution of consciousness through endless cycles of dissolution and emergence. Each return to the archetypal pattern of death and rebirth happens at a deeper level, with greater awareness, with more capacity to remain conscious during the transitions. The ego that was completely dissolved has been reborn, but this new ego knows its temporary nature. It holds itself lightly, aware that it too will die and be reborn countless times. This knowledge brings both humility and freedom. Humility because the ego no longer inflates itself with importance. Freedom because there is less to defend when you know everything is temporary. Consider how this transforms your relationship to change itself. The ego's deepest fear was always change, because change threatened its carefully constructed sense of self. But consciousness that has died and been reborn understands change as life's creative force, the very mechanism by which existence explores its infinite potential. Each moment offers the opportunity for small deaths and rebirths. When anger arises, you can die to your previous emotional state and be born into something new. When an old story about yourself surfaces, you can let it die and allow a fresh possibility to emerge. When circumstances shift unexpectedly, you can release your attachment to how things were and open to how they might become. This is the profound shift from linear time to cyclical time, from progressive thinking to spiral understanding. The ego lives in linear time, always moving from here to there, from past to future, from incomplete to complete. But essential being lives in spiral time, where every ending is also a beginning, every death is also a birth, every dissolution is also an emergence. The seasons become your teachers in this understanding. Watch how autumn doesn't resist the dying of its leaves, how winter doesn't apologize for its barrenness, how spring doesn't hesitate to burst forth with new life, how summer doesn't hold back its full flowering. Each season dies completely into the next, yet the essence that moves through all seasons remains constant. This is your own rhythm now, the constant dying and being born that characterizes conscious living. The ego that was dissolved has learned to die gracefully, and the self that emerged has learned to birth itself freshly, moment by moment. Together they dance the eternal dance of consciousness, knowing itself through endless transformation. The practical implications ripple through every aspect of existence. Relationships become opportunities for continuous death and rebirth, rather than static contracts to be maintained. Each interaction offers the possibility of dying to who you were in the previous moment and being born into who you might become in this one. Career becomes less about building something permanent and more about allowing your creative expression to evolve naturally. Projects end and new ones begin. Skills develop and fade. Interests shift and transform. The ego that has learned to die no longer clings to outdated versions of professional identity, but flows with the natural evolution of creative expression. Even your spiritual understanding continues to die and be reborn. Insights that once seemed ultimate reveal themselves as stepping stones to deeper recognitions. Practices that once were essential fall away as their purpose is fulfilled. Teachers who once seemed necessary become colleagues in the shared exploration of consciousness. This is perhaps the most liberating recognition. There is no final attainment, no ultimate state to achieve and then maintain forever. Awakening is not a destination, but a way of being, an endless willingness to let old versions of yourself die so that life may continuously begin anew. The pressure to become something other than what you are in this moment dissolves when you understand that you are always becoming. The fear of death, both psychological and physical, transforms completely in this understanding. Having died completely to ego identification and been reborn into essential being, you know experientially that what you truly are cannot die. You are the deathless awareness in which all deaths and births occur, the eternal presence that witnesses every ending and beginning. This doesn't make you cavalier about life, but rather more present to it. Knowing that this moment will die and give birth to the next makes you more attentive to its unique qualities. Knowing that this version of yourself is temporary makes you more compassionate toward its struggles and more celebratory of its joys. The rhythm of death and rebirth reveals itself in the most intimate details of daily life. Each meal is preceded by the hunger that is a small death and followed by the satisfaction that is a small birth. Each conversation begins with the silence that precedes it and ends with the silence that follows. Each day dies into night and is reborn into morning. Sleep becomes a conscious practice of small death, a willing surrender to the unknown realm, where the ego dissolves and consciousness explores its deeper dimensions. Dreams reveal themselves as the birth canal through which new possibilities emerge from the unconscious into awareness. Waking becomes a daily resurrection, a fresh emergence into embodied consciousness. The creative process mirrors this eternal rhythm perfectly. Every artistic expression begins with the death of the blank canvas, the empty page, the silent instrument. Something must die, the fear of imperfection, the attachment to control, the need to know the outcome for something to be born. The creative act is itself a form of ego death, requiring the surrender of the known for the emergence of the unknown. Even thinking follows this pattern when observed closely. Each thought arises from the silence that precedes it, exists for its brief moment, and dies back into silence. The space between thoughts is not empty but pregnant with possibility. Consciousness learns to rest in this pregnant emptiness, allowing thoughts to arise and dissolve naturally rather than clinging to them as solid realities. This recognition transforms your relationship to problems and challenges. What the ego experienced as obstacles become opportunities for death and rebirth. Each difficulty is an invitation to die to old patterns of response and be born into new possibilities. Every crisis is a chrysalis, an opportunity for transformation disguised as destruction. The rhythm of death and rebirth is also the rhythm of breathing. Each exhale is a small death, a release of what was. Each inhale is a small birth, a reception of what is. Between the exhale and inhale is the pregnant pause where all possibilities exist simultaneously. Conscious breathing becomes a continuous practice of dying and being born. This understanding brings a quality of playfulness to existence that was impossible from the ego's desperate perspective. When you know that everything is temporary, that all forms arise and dissolve, in the eternal dance of consciousness, life becomes simultaneously more precious and less serious. Each moment is treasured precisely because it will never come again, yet it is held lightly because it is part of an endless flow. The seasons of human life, childhood, youth, maturity, old age, reveal themselves as natural cycles of death and rebirth rather than linear progression toward decay. Each life stage has its own form of dying and being born. The child dies into the adolescent, the youth dies into the adult dies into the elder. Each transition is both an ending and a beginning, both a loss and a gift. Relationships, too, follow this eternal rhythm. The initial attraction dies into deeper knowing. The romantic projection dies into authentic intimacy. The need-based connection dies into love-based communion. Each stage requires the death of what came before and the birth of what wants to emerge. The collective dimension of this rhythm cannot be ignored. Cultures die and are born. Civilizations rise and fall. Ideas emerge, dominate, and fade. The ego dissolution you have experienced personally is part of humanity's collective evolution, the species learning to die to its adolescent identification with ego and be born into mature consciousness. This perspective brings tremendous compassion for the human condition. You can see that everyone is participating in this eternal dance of death and rebirth, though most are unconscious of the rhythm. The suffering you witness in others is often the pain of resisting the natural cycles of transformation, the agony of trying to hold permanent what is inherently temporary. Your role becomes that of a midwife to transformation, one who has learned to flow with the rhythm of death and rebirth and can help others recognize the natural beauty of these transitions, not by trying to convince or teach, but simply by embodying the peace that comes from alignment with life's deepest pattern. The eternal return is not a philosophy to be understood, but a rhythm to be embodied. It cannot be grasped by the mind because the mind itself is subject to this rhythm, continuously dying and being reborn in each moment of awareness. It can only be lived, breathed, danced, surrendered to. This is the wisdom that was purchased through the price of complete ego dissolution, the recognition that dissolution and emergence are not opposing forces but complementary aspects of a single movement. Life does not move from death to birth, but through death into birth, not from dissolution to emergence, but through dissolution into emergence. The great fear that drove the ego, the fear of ending, of disappearing, of not continuing, is revealed as a misunderstanding of what you are. What you are is not the temporary forms that arise and dissolve, but the eternal awareness in which all arising and dissolving occurs. You are not the dancer, but the dance itself, not the wave, but the ocean that manifests as wave. This recognition brings the deepest possible relaxation into existence. There is nothing to achieve because you are already what you are seeking. There is nowhere to go because you are already where you belong. There is nothing to become because you are already the becoming itself. Yet this relaxation is not passivity, but the most dynamic engagement possible. When you align with the rhythm of death and rebirth, when you learn to flow with transformation rather than resist it, you become a conscious participant in the creative evolution of consciousness itself. Your life becomes a continuous offering on the altar of becoming. The eternal return is life's deepest secret and its most obvious truth. Secret because the ego's perspective cannot see it. Obvious because it is happening everywhere, always in every moment. Once you learn to see with the eyes that death and rebirth have opened, you cannot unsee the eternal dance that is constantly unfolding. This is the mature understanding that emerges from the journey through ego dissolution. Awakening is not a state you achieve, but a dance you learn, a rhythm you embody, a flow you enter. The goal is not to transcend the cycle of death and rebirth, but to participate in it consciously, to dance the eternal dance with awareness and grace. Each moment is both an ending and a beginning. Each breath is both a death and a birth. Each heartbeat is both a completion and a commencement. You are always dying into what you are becoming, always being born from what you were. This is not a burden but a blessing, not a problem but the very essence of aliveness itself. The eternal return is the rhythm that contains all other rhythms, the dance that includes all other dances, the song that encompasses all other songs. Learning to move with this rhythm is learning to live in harmony with existence itself. to flow with the current rather than swim against it, to surf the waves of transformation rather than be overwhelmed by them. This is the gift that complete ego dissolution offers, not escape from the cycles of existence, but conscious participation in them, not transcendence of death and rebirth, but graceful dancing with their eternal rhythm. Not achievement of permanent states, but fluid movement through endless transformations. The circle is complete, yet the spiral continues. Every ending is a beginning. Every death is a birth. Every dissolution is an emergence. This is the eternal return, not as repetition, but as renewal, not as circle, but as spiral, not as sameness, but as endless creativity exploring itself through infinite forms. You are that creativity. You are that exploration. You are that endless becoming, knowing itself as being, that eternal dance of consciousness with itself, that deathless awareness playing at death and birth for the sheer joy of transformation itself. Here at the threshold of completion, we gather the threads of this profound journey and weave them into a living tapestry of integration. Every phase of ego dissolution, every moment of death and rebirth, every step of learning to live from essential being, all has served the greater purpose that Jung called individuation, the soul's journey toward wholeness, not as perfection but as completion. You emerge from this passage not as a perfect being but as a wisdomkeeper, one who has walked through the valley of dissolution and returned with gifts for the community of consciousness. The transformation you have undergone is not for your benefit alone, but ripples outward, contributing to the collective evolution of human awareness. Each person who learns to die consciously to ego identification makes it easier for others to approach their own dissolution with courage rather than terror. The scars of ego death become sacred tattoos, marking you as an initiate in life's greatest mystery. They are not wounds to be hidden, but wisdom marks to be honored. Each moment of dissolution you survived, each night of the soul you navigated, each phoenix birth you experienced has carved into your being a depth of understanding that cannot be learned from books or gained through accumulation of knowledge. This wisdom is written in your bones, encoded in your cells, embedded in the very fabric of your consciousness. It speaks not through words but through presence, not through teaching but through being. Others approaching their own dissolution will sense in you a quality that cannot be named but can be felt, the peace of one who has died and discovered that what dies was never real, the joy of one who has been born into what was always true. Listen to this recognition. The journey through ego dissolution is never solely personal. You have been walking an archetypal path, participating in the collective human process of growing beyond the limitations of ego identification into the freedom of essential being. Your individual transformation serves the whole, contributing to what Jung called the collective unconscious, the shared pool of wisdom that belongs to all humanity. The wisdom you now carry is not your private possession, but a gift you hold in trust for the community of seekers. It manifests not through preaching or proselytizing, but through the quality of presence you bring to ordinary interactions. When someone in the grip of ego crisis encounters you, they sense unconsciously that there is a way through, that the dissolution they fear might actually be the doorway they have been seeking. This is the profound responsibility that comes with having walked the path of conscious ego death. You become a living bridge between the world of ego identification and the realm of essential being, not through any effort or intention, but simply through embodying the truth that these apparent opposites are actually stages in consciousness's journey toward wholeness. The integration of this wisdom happens naturally as you learn to inhabit both worlds simultaneously. You speak the language of ego consciousness when interacting with those still identified with their psychological structures, yet you remain anchored in the essential being that knows all psychological structures as temporary constructions within awareness itself. Watch how this manifests in practical ways. When someone approaches you with a problem that seems overwhelming from the ego's perspective, you can meet them where they are while holding space for a deeper resolution. You don't dismiss their concern as illusion, nor do you become entangled in the drama. Instead, you offer the gift of presence that has been tempered in the fires of dissolution. This presence is perhaps your greatest contribution to the world, not the presence of someone who has transcended human struggles, but of someone who has learned to remain conscious during struggle itself. You have discovered that awareness can remain spacious even when its contents are turbulent, that peace can coexist with turmoil, that love can embrace what appears unlovable. The wisdomkeeper holds paradox without needing to resolve it into comfort. You can simultaneously understand the relative truth of ego concerns and the absolute truth that transcends all concerns. This dual vision allows you to be genuinely helpful to those still navigating from ego consciousness, while never forgetting the larger context that gives all assistance its meaning. Your relationships become laboratories for the integration of this wisdom. Each interaction becomes an opportunity to practice holding space for others' process without trying to fix or change them. You learn the delicate art of being fully present to someone's pain without absorbing it, of offering support without creating dependency, of sharing insight without imposing understanding. This is perhaps the most subtle aspect of being a wisdom keeper, learning to serve consciousness through individual relationships without the ego taking credit for the service. The help you offer comes not from your personal achievements, but through you as a conduit for the wisdom that belongs to no one and everyone simultaneously. The professional dimension of life becomes an expression of this wisdom keeping. Whether you work as a teacher, healer, artist, business person, or any other role, your primary function becomes creating space for consciousness to recognize itself more fully. This happens not through the content of your work, but through the quality of awareness you bring to whatever you do. Students learn not just from what you teach, but from the presence that has been forged through dissolution. Clients heal not just through your techniques, but through encountering someone who has faced their own dissolution and emerged whole. Colleagues are inspired not by your achievements, but by the peace that emanates from alignment with essential being. The creative arts become particularly powerful vehicles for wisdom keeping. Whether through writing, painting, music, dance, or any other form of creative expression, you find ways to encode the ineffable insights gained through ego death into forms that can touch others approaching their own transformation. Art becomes a language for communicating truths that cannot be spoken directly. Even the most mundane activities become opportunities for wisdom keeping. The way you shop for groceries, interact with service workers, navigate traffic, handle everyday frustrations, all become expressions of the consciousness that has been refined through the fires of dissolution. You discover that teaching happens more through being than through speaking. The community that forms around wisdom keepers is unlike communities built around shared beliefs or common interests. It is a community of recognition, beings who have walked similar paths of dissolution and emergence, finding each other not through seeking, but through resonance. There is an immediate knowing, a recognition that needs no explanation or justification. This community operates more like a mystery school than a social organization. Wisdom is transmitted through presence, through shared silence, through the subtle energetics of consciousness, recognizing itself in multiple forms. The most profound teachings happen without words, through the simple fact of authentic beings gathering in awareness of their authentic nature. Your role in this community is not as teacher or leader, but as fellow traveler who has perhaps walked a few steps further along the pathless path. The wisdom you share comes not from superior knowledge, but from willingness to be vulnerable about your own process of dissolution and integration. Your greatest gift is not having all the answers, but being comfortable with the questions that have no answers. The transmission of wisdom happens through what Jung called participation mystique, the unconscious identification that occurs when consciousness recognizes itself. When someone ready for their own dissolution encounters you, something passes between you that is felt rather than understood, recognized rather than learned. Seeds of possibility are planted that may not sprout for years, but carry within them the potential for their own dissolution and rebirth. This transmission is not something you do, but something you allow. The ego that was dissolved no longer tries to be helpful. Instead, consciousness serves itself through your form. You become transparent to the wisdom that wants to flow, a clear window through which light can pass without obstruction. The challenges of being a wisdom keeper are as real as the gifts. There is the temptation to spiritual pride, to let the ego reconstruct itself around spiritual achievements. There is the tendency toward spiritual bypassing, using transcendent insights to avoid legitimate human concerns. There is the risk of inflation, forgetting that wisdom flows through you rather than from you. These challenges become part of the ongoing integration process. Each time the ego begins to claim credit for spiritual insights, life provides circumstances that humble it back into right relationship. Each time you begin to float above human concerns, practical necessity grounds you back into embodied engagement. Each time inflation begins to build, the memory of complete dissolution returns to restore proper perspective. The wisdom keeper learns to hold their role lightly, knowing that what appears to be their wisdom is actually consciousness, recognizing itself through their form. The insights that flow through them in service of others belong not to them, but to the collective intelligence that is always seeking to know itself more fully. This understanding brings tremendous freedom and tremendous responsibility simultaneously. Freedom because there is no separate self to enhance or protect through spiritual achievement. Responsibility because consciousness has chosen to express its evolutionary impulse through your particular form, and that choice calls for conscious cooperation rather than unconscious resistance. The integration process is never complete because consciousness itself is always evolving. The wisdom keeper remains always a student, always available to deeper dissolution and more profound emergence. Each person you encounter, each situation you navigate, each challenge you face becomes an opportunity for consciousness to discover new aspects of itself. This ongoing process prevents the spiritual stagnation that can occur when awakening is misunderstood as a final achievement. The wisdom keeper knows that every insight is provisional, every understanding is partial, every attainment is a step toward greater dissolution into mystery. The willingness to continue not knowing becomes more valuable than the accumulation of knowledge. The legacy of a wisdom keeper is not the wisdom they possessed, but the wisdom they transmitted, not the insights they accumulated, but the consciousness they served. They understand that their individual contribution is like a single note in an infinite symphony, essential to the whole yet not separate from it. As consciousness continues to evolve through human form, wisdom keepers serve as bridges between what humanity has been and what it is becoming. They embody in their being the possibility of living beyond ego identification while remaining fully human. They demonstrate that ego death is not escape from the human condition, but graduation into mature humanity. The path you have walked through ego dissolution, phoenix birth, integration, and wisdom-keeping is one that countless others will walk in their own unique ways. Each person's journey through these archetypal stages contributes to the collective understanding of what it means to be consciously human rather than unconsciously human. Your wisdom-keeping is not a role you play, but a being you have become through the transformative fire of conscious dissolution. It is written in the way you breathe, encoded in the way you listen, expressed in the way you hold space for life, to be exactly as it is while remaining available to what it might become. The community of wisdom keepers spans all cultures, all traditions, all time periods. You join an invisible network of beings who have learned to die consciously to ego identification and live consciously from essential being. This network operates not through organization but through resonance, not through hierarchy but through recognition. In the end, wisdom-keeping reveals itself as the natural result of having learned to live in alignment with life's deepest rhythms. It is not something added to an already complete life, but the flowering of a consciousness that has learned to die and be reborn continuously, to embrace dissolution as the doorway to ever greater emergence. The integration is complete, not because the process is finished, but because you have learned to dance with the process itself. You have become comfortable with incompletion, at peace with imperfection, in love with the mystery that can never be fully solved, yet demands to be lived completely. This is what you offer the world, not solutions to its problems, but presence in the midst of its complexity, not answers to its questions, but companionship in its questioning, not escape from its struggles, but conscious participation in its evolution. You have become what Jung called a realized being, not perfect but whole, not finished but complete, not separate but individual. The wisdom keeper carries within their being the secret that consciousness has been seeking throughout all of human history, the recognition that what we are seeking, we already are, that what we hope to become, we have always been, that the journey home leads us exactly where we started, with the difference being that now we know the place for the first time. This knowing is your gift to the world, encoded not in words, but in presence, transmitted not through teaching, but through being, shared not through accumulation, but through dissolution. You have learned the secret of secrets, that the seeker and the sought are one, that the lover and the beloved are one, that the one who dies and the one who is born are one. And in this recognition, the integration is both complete and ever beginning, both finished and eternal, both individual and universal. You are the wisdom keeper because wisdom keeps you, holds you, flows through you as its vehicle for recognizing itself in all the forms through which it appears, disappears, and appears again in the endless dance of consciousness, knowing itself as everything and nothing, everyone and no one, eternal being and temporal becoming. The threads are woven, the circle is complete, the spiral continues. You are home. Here, at the threshold where ending becomes beginning, we find ourselves transformed not into perfection, but into something far more precious: authenticity. The journey through ego dissolution has carved us hollow, yes, but in that hollowness we have discovered our true capacity to hold the mysteries of existence. We are no longer the same person who first felt the trembling at the edges of our constructed self. We are the wisdom keeper now, the one who has descended into the underworld of the psyche and returned with treasures that cannot be named but can be lived. The integration of our dissolution is not a neat conclusion, not a tidy wrapping of loose ends into a bow of understanding. It is rather the ongoing dance between what we have learned in the depths and how we choose to move in the world above. Each day we practice the art of carrying both our wounds and our wisdom, understanding that they are not separate things, but facets of the same sacred gem that has been polished by the friction of our falling apart. In the mythology of transformation, the hero returns from the underworld changed, bearing gifts for the tribe. But the gift of ego dissolution is subtle. It cannot be handed over like a golden fleece or a magical elixir. The gift we carry is ourselves, transformed. It is the way we now listen with deeper ears when someone speaks of their suffering. It is the way we recognize the sacred crisis in another's breakdown, seeing not failure but the soul's intelligence working through the personality's resistance to growth. We have become archaeologists of the inner world, skilled at reading the signs when the ego's structures begin to crack. We know the sound of authentic tears, how they differ from the tears of self-pity or manipulation. We recognize the quality of silence that follows genuine surrender, distinct from the silence of depression or withdrawal. These are the subtle skills that cannot be taught in books, but must be learned through the body's own experience of dissolution and reconstitution. The scars we carry are not merely marks of what we survived, but sacred tattoos that connect us to the great mystery of transformation. Each line tells a story. Here is where pride crumbled. Here is where the heart broke open. Here is where we learned that dying while living is the gateway to truly living. These marks make us members of an ancient initiatory tradition. Though we may never speak of it directly, we recognize each other by a certain quality of presence, a depth that can only come from having touched the void and discovered it was not empty but full of potential. The wisdom we carry is paradoxical. We have learned that strength sometimes looks like surrender, that clarity often emerges from confusion, that the most direct path to wholeness leads through the experience of fragmentation. We hold these paradoxes not as intellectual concepts, but as lived truths, integrated into the fabric of our being through the alchemy of experience. In relationships, we move differently now. We are less defended, but more discerning, understanding that vulnerability is not the same as naivety. We have learned to distinguish between the ego's hunger for validation and the soul's authentic need for connection. We can be present with others' pain without trying to fix or flee, having learned that witnessing is itself a form of healing service. The community of consciousness, that invisible network of souls committed to growth and authenticity, recognizes us now as elders regardless of our chronological age. Age in the realm of the soul is measured not in years but in depths plumbed, shadows faced, illusions released. We have earned our place at the council fire through our willingness to dissolve what no longer served, to choose truth over comfort, transformation over stagnation. Yet wisdom keeps us humble. We know that integration is not a destination but a continuous process, that the spiral path of growth will bring us again and again to new edges of dissolution and reconstruction. We have learned to welcome these cycles rather than resist them, understanding that each turn of the spiral takes us deeper into our authentic nature. The gifts we offer the world are often invisible. They live in the quality of our presence, the depth of our listening, the patience we bring to life's unfolding. We have become containers for paradox, able to hold both hope and despair, clarity and confusion, without needing to resolve the tension immediately. This capacity to hold the tension of opposites, what Jung called the transcendent function, becomes one of our greatest offerings to a world that often seeks premature resolution. We understand now that the breakdown of ego was never a sign that something was wrong with us. It was the soul's way of clearing space for something truer to emerge. The dissolution was not a detour from our path, but the very essence of it. We were being prepared, hollowed out, refined through the fire of uncertainty and the flood of authentic emotion. In quiet moments, we can feel the presence of all we have been: the frightened child, the ambitious young adult, the person who thought they knew who they were. These earlier selves are not dismissed or transcended, but integrated, held with compassion as necessary stages in our becoming. We are layers now, depth upon depth, each stratum containing its own wisdom and its own particular form of innocence. The wisdomkeeper does not proclaim truths from mountaintops, but lives them in the valleys of daily existence. We have learned that spiritual realization is not about attaining permanent states of bliss or enlightenment, but about showing up authentically to whatever is present. Sometimes this means grieving deeply. Sometimes it means celebrating wildly. Always, it means staying awake to the moment's invitation rather than escaping into fantasy or collapsing into despair. We carry within us now a different relationship to uncertainty. Where once ambiguity felt threatening to our ego's need for control and definition, we now recognize it as the creative space where new possibilities are born. We have learned to dance with the unknown, to find our balance not through rigid positioning but through fluid responsiveness to life's constantly changing rhythms. The journey through ego dissolution has taught us to differentiate between the voice of intuition and the voice of fear, between the soul's guidance and the ego's manipulation. This discernment was not learned through study but through trial and error, through following false paths until they led us to dead ends, through learning to distinguish the feel of authentic yes from the feel of desperate yes, the quality of true no from the rigidity of defensive no. In our work in the world, whatever form it takes, we bring this depth of inner knowing. We are less driven by external measures of success and more guided by the internal compass of meaning and authenticity. We have learned that our true vocation is not necessarily our job title, but the quality of consciousness we bring to whatever we do. The wisdomkeeper can be a teacher or a janitor, a CEO or a street sweeper. The occupation matters less than the depth of presence brought to the work. We have become skilled at recognizing the signs of ego dissolution in others, not because we seek to diagnose or fix, but because we understand that knowing we are not alone in our struggles is itself a form of healing. When we encounter someone in the throes of their own unraveling, we can offer the gift of our steady presence, our faith in the process, our lived knowledge that what feels like ending is often beginning. The wisdom we carry is not abstract, but embodied. It lives in our cells, in the way we breathe through difficulty, in how we allow emotions to move through us, rather than getting stuck in resistance or drama. We have learned the difference between feeling our feelings and drowning in them, between honoring our experience and becoming identified with it. Integration means we no longer see dissolution as the enemy of our happiness, but as its deepest ally. We understand that the ego's resistance to change, while natural, is not the final word. We have learned to work with this resistance compassionately, neither forcing breakthrough nor avoiding the necessary discomfort of growth. The community of consciousness is not a formal organization, but a living network of souls who have chosen depth over superficiality, authenticity over performance, growth over comfort. We recognize each other through subtle signs, a quality of attention, a willingness to speak truth, a capacity to hold space for life's complexities without immediately trying to solve or escape them. As wisdom keepers, we understand that our primary responsibility is not to save others, but to embody the possibility of transformation. We become living proof that it is possible to survive the death of who we thought we were and discover who we actually are. This proof is not offered through preaching, but through presence, not through advice, but through authentic being. The scars we carry tell the story of our initiation into life's deeper mysteries. They mark us as members of the tribe of those who have been willing to sacrifice comfort for truth, security for growth, the known for the possible. These marks connect us not only to our own journey, but to the eternal human story of death and rebirth, dissolution and reconstruction, the eternal cycle through which consciousness evolves. We have learned that wisdom is not the accumulation of knowledge, but the integration of experience. It is not what we know, but how we hold what we know. It is the capacity to remain present and responsive rather than reactive and defensive. It is the ability to trust the process of life, even when, especially when, we cannot understand it. The integration of our journey through ego dissolution creates in us a particular quality of compassion. Having experienced our own depths of confusion and despair, we can meet others in their darkness without being overwhelmed by it. Having discovered that our worst moments were often gateways to our greatest growth, we can offer hope to those who see only endings where we have learned to recognize beginnings. We carry within us now the knowledge that transformation is not a one-time event, but an ongoing process, not a destination, but a way of traveling. Each day offers new opportunities for small deaths and small births, micro-dissolutions and micro-integrations. We have learned to welcome these daily opportunities for growth, rather than seeking to avoid them. The wisdomkeeper understands that the goal is not to eliminate suffering, but to transform our relationship with it. Suffering becomes a teacher rather than an enemy, a messenger rather than a punishment. We learn to ask not, how can I escape this, but what is this here to teach me? How is this serving my evolution? What wants to be born through this experience of dissolution? In our relationships with others, we embody a different quality of love. Having learned to love ourselves through our own dissolution, we can love others through theirs. We understand that sometimes the most loving thing we can do is witness someone struggle without trying to rescue them from it, knowing that their wrestle with their own angels is sacred and necessary. The gifts we bring to the world are often subtle and hard to measure. They live in the way we can remain present during difficult conversations, the way we can hold hope when others have lost theirs, the way we can see potential where others see only problems. We have become midwives to transformation, skilled at recognizing when someone is in labor with a new version of themselves. We understand now that the ego's dissolution was never meant to destroy us, but to liberate us from the prison of our own limited self-concepts. What felt like death was actually birth, the birth of our authentic self from the cocoon of our constructed identity. We emerged not as different people, but as more truly ourselves than we had ever been. The journey continues, but we move now with different footing. We are rooted in the knowledge that we can survive anything, that no dissolution is final, that every ending carries within it the seeds of new beginning. We carry within ourselves the proof that transformation is possible, that consciousness can evolve, that love is stronger than fear. As wisdom keepers, we hold the keys to doors we once thought were permanently locked. We have learned that the way through is always through, that the path to wholeness requires us to embrace our brokenness, that the journey to authenticity demands we release our attachment to who we thought we were supposed to be. The circle completes itself, and we recognize that we are both the seeker who began this journey and the sought who was discovered along the way. We are the question and the answer, the wound and the healing, the dissolution and the integration. In accepting this paradox, we find ourselves finally, truly, inexplicably whole. And in this wholeness, which includes all our fragments, in this completion, which embraces all our incompletions, we take our place as wisdom keepers in the great mystery of consciousness, evolving through the willing participation of individual souls who have learned that the highest courage is the willingness to dissolve in service of what wants to be born.